Hey guys, tonight we are heading somewhere so cold that the air itself becomes your enemy. Not the uncomfortable kind of cold where you shiver a little and reach for an extra blanket. No, we're talking about the kind of cold where your breath freezes before it leaves your lips, where exposed skin begins to die within minutes, and where the thermometer has long since given up trying to make sense of things. Tonight, you are in Yakutia, in the far northeastern reaches of Russia, and the temperature outside is minus 71 degrees Celsius. You probably won't survive this, but let's try anyway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is, because wherever you are right now, it is almost certainly warmer than where you're about to spend the next little while. Someone's going to comment from a cozy bedroom in Florida at 11 p.m. and honestly, good for you. Hold on to that warmth. You're going to want to remember it. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You land, if landing is even the right word for what the ancient propeller plane does when it bumps and skids across the runway at Yakutsk Airport, sometime in the deep hollow of a January afternoon. Except it doesn't look like afternoon. It looks like the middle of the night, because here, in the coldest permanently inhabited place on the surface of the Earth, the sun has already set. It set around 2 in the afternoon. It rose briefly around 10 in the morning. That gives you roughly 4 hours of pale, watery daylight per day at the height of winter, and even during those hours the sun never climbs high enough to offer any warmth whatsoever. It schemes the horizon like a stone thrown flat across a frozen lake, offering light without heat, presence without comfort, and then it disappears again into the blue-black dark that swallows everything. You step off the plane and the cold hits you like a physical object. This is not a metaphor. At minus 71 degrees Celsius, which is minus 96 Fahrenheit, for those of you keeping track at home, the air has a density and a hostility to it that you have never experienced and that no amount of intellectual preparation could have readied you for. Your nostrils freeze on the first inhale. Not the inside of your nose, exactly, but the moisture in the tiny hairs there crystallizes instantly, and you get a strange, delicate crackling sensation with every breath, as though your face is made of spun glass. Your eyelashes, within seconds, are fringed with frost. The exposed strip of skin between your goggles and your balaclava, a strip perhaps 2 centimeters wide, begins to sting almost immediately. You have, the locals will later tell you, about 4 minutes of exposed skin tolerance in these conditions before frostbite begins to set in. They say this casually, the way someone might mention that the coffee shop closes at 6. For minutes, you file this away. Yakutsk, the capital of the Sakha Republic, sits on the banks of the Lena River, one of the great rivers of the world, though right now it is buried under meters of ice so thick that trucks drive across it as a matter of routine. The city itself is home to roughly 300,000 people, which makes it the largest city in the world built on continuous permafrost. That permafrost, the permanently frozen ground that begins just below the surface and extends downward for hundreds of meters, is the reason all the buildings here are raised on stilts. Heat from a building sitting directly on permafrost would melt the ground beneath it, and the structure would slowly, catastrophically sink. So the city floats, in a sense, elevated above its own frozen foundation, pipes insulated and bundled above ground because burying them in the permafrost and then trying to heat them would be an engineering nightmare of the first order. You notice all of this in a kind of dazed, sensory-overloaded blur as your guide. A compact, deeply weathered man named Semyon, who is wearing a traditional Yakut coat called a doha, made from reindeer hide with the fur facing inward, leads you toward the staging area where your sled and supplies are waiting. He moves with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has never once been surprised by the cold. You move with the lurching urgency of someone who very much has been. The sled itself is your first real introduction to the physical reality of what you've signed up for. It is not romantic. It is not the sleek, dog-powered thing of adventure novel fantasy. It is a heavy, wooden-framed pulk, a type of sled common in Scandinavian and Siberian travel traditions, loaded with your tent, sleeping system, food supplies for 6 days, a portable stove and fuel canisters, emergency equipment, and roughly 40 kilograms of gear in total. You will be pulling this behind you, attached to your harness by two rigid fiberglass poles, across approximately 70 kilometers of frozen taiga and open steppe. The ground is not flat, the wind is not absent, and the temperature will not rise above -40 for the duration of your journey. You stare at the sled for a moment. The sled stares back. Historically, the indigenous Saka people, often called Yakuts, though Saka is the name they use for themselves, have been living and traveling in these conditions for centuries, adapting over generations to an environment that seems designed specifically to kill human beings. Mainstream historians generally agree that the Saka migrated northward into this region from more southerly parts of Siberia, likely somewhere around the 13th or 14th century, pushing ever further into the extreme north and developing, over time, a suite of cultural, technological, and physiological adaptations that allowed them not merely to survive but to genuinely thrive in conditions that would flatten most of the rest of humanity within hours. One of the quirkier tidbits in the ethnographic literature, which you will have plenty of time to think about as you walk, is that the Saka language contains an extraordinarily rich vocabulary for different kinds of snow and ice conditions, somewhere in the range of 20+ distinct terms, reflecting the degree to which reading frozen terrain is not an academic exercise here but a survival skill as fundamental as breathing. Historians still argue, by the way, about the precise migration routes and timelines that brought the Saka's ancestors into this region, and about the degree to which they absorbed or displaced earlier peoples who were already living in the Yakutian basin. The archaeological record is incomplete, the permafrost having both preserved some things beautifully and rendered other excavations nearly impossible. But none of that is your immediate problem. Your immediate problem is layering. Semyon walks you through this with the patience of a man who has seen unprepared outsiders make every possible mistake. The principle, he explains through your interpreter, is simple: moisture kills. Sweat is as dangerous as wind chill in these temperatures because wet fabric, any wet fabric, no matter how technically advanced, loses the majority of its insulating capacity. The goal of your layering system is to move moisture away from your skin, trap warm air close to your body, and present a wind-resistant shell to the outside world, all while remaining flexible enough that you can actually move and pull a 40-kilogram sled across broken terrain. Your base layer is a merino wool thermal set. Wool because it retains some insulating capacity even when damp, unlike synthetic materials which can feel clammy and cold against the skin if you sweat heavily. Over that goes a mid-weight fleece, then a heavy synthetic insulated jacket, then the outer shell, a windproof, water-resistant smock that covers everything down to mid-thigh. Your legs have a similar system: thermal tights, fleece pants, windproof over-trousers. Your feet are in liner socks, then wool socks, then vapor barrier socks, a controversial piece of cold weather kit that creates a sealed environment around the foot to prevent moisture from migrating into your outer boots, and then into traditional Yakut torbesa, reindeer hide boots that Semyon has sourced specifically for this trip, because at these temperatures, modern synthetic insulated boots simply are not sufficient for extended outdoor exposure. Your hands are in a similar multi-layer system: liner gloves, heavy insulated mitts, and an outer shell that you can clip off quickly if you need to do anything requiring dexterity. Though Semyon warns you that anything requiring bare fingers in this cold needs to be accomplished in under 30 seconds or you risk damaging the tissue. Your face is the final puzzle. A balaclava covers your head and face from just below your eyes to your collarbone. Over that, glacier goggles seal around your eyes. The 2-centimeter gap between goggle and balaclava, the strip that stung you on the runway, is bridged now by a separate neoprene face mask that you breathe through, which warms and humidifies the air slightly before it hits your airways. Breathing very cold, very dry air directly is hard on the lungs. At -71, it is genuinely dangerous. Semyon looks you over when you are done dressing, tugs a few things into place, adjusts your goggle strap, and says something in Saka that your interpreter translates as, "You look like a person who might survive until tomorrow." High praise. You clip into your sled harness, feel the weight of it settle against your hips and shoulders, and take your first step into the landscape. The taiga begins at the edge of Yakutsk like a held breath. Dense, dark stands of larch trees, their branches stripped bare in winter, rising from the snow like gray bristles. The larch is the defining tree of this part of Siberia, notable for being the world's most cold-tolerant tree species, capable of surviving soil temperatures well below freezing by essentially shutting down its own metabolic processes during winter. Unlike most conifers, the Siberian larch drops its needles in autumn, a deciduous adaptation that allows it to shed the weight of ice accumulation that would snap an evergreen's branches. Walking among them in the blue-hour light of mid-afternoon, their bare silver forms rising around you and receding into the distance, is oddly beautiful, like a forest that has been distilled down to its essential structure, like the idea of a tree made visible. The sled follows behind you with a low hiss against the packed snow. The cold settles around you like something physical, something you are moving through rather than merely experiencing. Each breath is a small negotiation. The silence is absolute, and you walk. The first thing you learn about pulling a sled in extreme cold is that your relationship with your own body changes almost immediately. Within 5 minutes of walking, you are warm. Not comfortable warm, not the pleasant flush of a brisk autumn stroll. Genuinely, surprisingly, almost alarmingly warm, because the work of hauling 40 kilograms across snow requires your muscles to generate significant heat, and all that careful layering is now doing its job almost too well. You feel the first thin film of sweat beginning to form along your back and across your shoulders, and Semyon, who has been watching you from a few paces ahead, holds up a hand. Stop. You stop. He gestures at your outer jacket, the signal to open your venting zips, release some heat, regulate. You do. A billow of steam rises from the opening like you have briefly become a small volcano, and the cold air that replaces it is so sharp it makes your eyes water. But the principle is clear, and you will spend the rest of this journey walking a thermal tightrope, generating enough heat through exertion to stay warm, but not so much that sweat accumulates in your layers and turns into a clammy, cold, potentially deadly liability the moment you slow down or stop. This balance between movement and stillness, between heat generation and heat retention, is one of the central physical challenges of cold weather travel, and it is something the Saka have understood intuitively for generations. Their traditional garments, including the doha that Semyon is wearing, with its complex layering of hides and furs arranged to allow ventilation while blocking wind, represent centuries of empirical refinement of exactly this problem. Modern technical fabrics and moisture-wicking membranes are, in many respects, simply a synthetic rediscovery of principles that indigenous cold-weather peoples worked out long ago through the simple and unforgiving feedback loop of survival. You regulate. You begin walking again. The landscape beyond the edge of Yakutsk opens up gradually. The larch forest thins over the first few kilometers, giving way to low scrub willow and alder, and then to stretches of open ground where the wind has scoured the snow into hard, rippled patterns. Sastrugi, they're called, these wind-carved ridges of compacted snow, and they range in height from a few centimeters to nearly half a meter. Pulling your sled over them is like hauling it across a frozen, abstract sculpture park. The runners catch on the ridges and drag. You lean into the harness. Your thighs and hips and lower back begin quietly to register their opinions. The sky above you is a color that doesn't have a good name in English. Not black, not blue. Something deeper and more saturated than either, pricked through with stars that seem sharper and more numerous than anything you've seen before, because the air here at minus 71 degrees Celsius contains almost no humidity, almost no particulates, nothing to scatter or blur the starlight. The Milky Way is not a suggestion up here. It is a fact, vivid and overwhelming, a white river of light overhead that makes you feel simultaneously very small and very specifically located in the universe. You stop walking for a moment, just a moment, because stopping is dangerous, and look up. Semyon says something. Your interpreter has fallen into a walking silence of concentration, but translates after a beat. He says the Saka believe the stars are the campfires of ancestors. The whole sky is a village of people who have already made this journey. You look at the stars for another second, feel the cold reasserting itself against your stillness, and begin walking again. The route you are following today, the first of what will be a 6-day traverse, traces a path that Saka traders and hunters used for centuries before roads, before snowmobiles, before any of the modern infrastructure that now connects the scattered settlements of Yakutia. These overland winter routes, called Zimniki in Russian, winter roads, were the arteries of life in this region, passable only when the ground and waterways were frozen solid enough to support travel, and impassable during the brief, boggy summers when the permafrost surface layer melted into a sodden, insect-ridden tundra that swallowed vehicles and exhausted horses with equal indifference. The winter, paradoxically, was the season of connection. The cold was what made movement possible. You think about this as you walk. The inversion of it. That what looks from the outside like the most hostile possible environment was, for the people who learned to read it, a kind of infrastructure. A road system laid down by physics. Frozen rivers as highways. Ice as pavement. Cold as enabler. The weight of the sled shifts slightly as you crest a low rise, and for a moment the tension in the fiberglass poles goes slack. You've crested the grade, and the sled is briefly pushing rather than being pulled, and you have to adjust your gait to keep it from running into the back of your legs. Semyon demonstrates the technique without being asked. A slight widening of stance, a lean back into the poles, letting the sled's weight transfer through your hips rather than fighting it. Small adjustments, constant reading of the terrain and the load. The sled is not a passive object you are simply dragging behind you. It is a negotiation. By the time the first kilometer marker, a paint-faded wooden post half buried in a drift, appears ahead, your legs have settled into something that feels almost like a rhythm. Not comfortable exactly, but familiar. The cold has moved from being a shock to being a texture, a constant presence that you are navigating rather than reacting to. Your breathing has found a pace. Your goggles have fogged and cleared and fogged again, and you've learned the trick of tilting your chin slightly down to direct your exhaled breath away from the lenses. Semyon glances back at you, evaluates something in your posture or your gait, and gives a small nod. This, you understand, is approximately the highest compliment available. The larch forest closes in again on either side of the track, and the sound of your footsteps, the soft, compressed squeak of boots on very cold, very dry snow, a sound that is specific to temperatures below about -20 and doesn't occur at warmer temperatures, is the loudest thing in the world. No birds, no wind right now, though that will change. No traffic, no voices, no hum of electricity or civilization. Just the squeak of snow and the hiss of the sled and your own breath, crystallizing and drifting behind you in small, brief clouds that the cold takes apart almost before they've formed. You are, for the first time in perhaps your entire adult life, genuinely alone with the landscape in a way that has weight to it, consequence to it. The nearest heated building is roughly 4 kilometers behind you. The nearest settlement ahead is 20 kilometers away. In between is the taiga, the cold, the stars, and the sled. And you, walking. The human body was not designed for -71 degrees Celsius. This is not an opinion. This is a straightforward engineering assessment, and your body begins making it very clear within the first hour of travel. Here is what is happening inside you right now, whether you are aware of it or not. Your core, the cylinder of vital organs running from your chest down through your abdomen, is the thing your body has decided, in its ancient and unsentimental wisdom, to protect above all else. Heart, lungs, liver, kidneys. These are the non-negotiables, the irreplaceable infrastructure, and your body will sacrifice literally everything else to keep them at 37 degrees Celsius. The fingers go first, then the toes, then the ears and nose and the tips of cheeks. The body reads these extremities as expendable outposts, metabolically expensive to heat, geographically inconvenient, defensible only at great cost, and it begins quietly withdrawing the garrison. Blood vessels in your hands and feet constrict. Blood flow is redirected inward. Your fingers, even inside their layered mitts, are receiving less warmth than they were 20 minutes ago, and they are telling you about it in the only language they have, which is a deep, persistent, bone-level ache that starts at the knuckles and works its way inward. This process is called peripheral vasoconstriction, and it is one of the body's oldest and most effective cold weather responses. It is also the mechanism that makes frostbite possible, because tissue that isn't receiving adequate blood flow is tissue that can freeze. The freezing of tissue is not, medically speaking, a simple process. It happens in stages. First, the skin surface cools and the tissue becomes numb, a phase called frostnip, which is reversible if you warm the area promptly. Then, if exposure continues, ice crystals begin to form between the cells, drawing water out of the cells themselves through osmotic pressure and causing cellular dehydration, even as the tissue is literally freezing. Then, in severe cases, ice crystals form inside the cells, rupturing the cell walls. That damage is permanent. The tissue, once thawed, will be found to have died. You check your fingers. Still moving. Still reporting sensation, though it is not pleasant sensation. You make a fist inside your mitt, release it, make it again, the recommended technique for maintaining circulation, and keep walking. Semyon, ahead of you, shows no apparent awareness that any of this is happening. He has been walking in these temperatures on and off for the better part of 60 years, and his body has made certain long-term adaptations that yours has not. Studies of indigenous peoples living in extreme cold environments, the Inuit of the Arctic, the Sami of Scandinavia, and the Saka of Yakutia among them, have documented a measurable difference in peripheral blood flow responses compared to non-adapted populations. Where your blood vessels clamp down hard and early in response to cold, trading off finger warmth for core protection, Saka individuals tend to show a more nuanced vascular response, periodic bursts of warm blood into the extremities, a kind of controlled flushing that prevents tissue damage without fully compromising core temperature regulation. It is called the hunting response or the Lewis wave, and it appears to be partly physiological and partly the result of a lifetime of cold exposure beginning in early childhood, when the body's vascular systems are still plastic and trainable. In other words, Semyon's fingers are probably fine right now. Yours are a project in progress. The cold also does something to your lungs that takes longer to notice but is impossible, once noticed, to ignore. The air at -71 is extraordinarily dry, almost entirely devoid of moisture, and your respiratory system, which is designed to warm and humidify incoming air before it reaches your delicate lung tissue, is working at enormous overcapacity trying to condition every breath. Your airways are producing mucus at an accelerated rate, which is why your nose is running constantly and why there is frost forming on the outside of your face mask from the moisture your breath deposits there. Deep breaths feel slightly raw, slightly abraded, like the inside of your chest has been lightly sandpapered. This is not imaginary. Breathing very cold, very dry air at high volumes, such as the volumes required by the sustained aerobic exertion of pulling a loaded sled, can cause a condition called exercise-induced bronchospasm, a temporary narrowing of the airways triggered by the drying and cooling of the bronchial lining. Professional athletes training in very cold conditions know it as a tightening in the chest, a slight wheeze on the exhale, a sense that your lungs are smaller than they should be. You breathe through your nose as much as possible, because the nasal passages are better designed for air conditioning than the mouth. You keep your chin slightly down. You monitor your chest for that telltale tightening. So far, manageable. Meanwhile, your metabolism has shifted into a register you've never operated in before. At rest, a human body generates roughly 80 watts of heat, about the same as an old incandescent light bulb, which is a comparison that never fails to be both illuminating and slightly humbling. At the level of exertion required to haul a 40-kilogram sled over broken terrain, your metabolic rate has climbed to somewhere between 400 and 600 watts. You are generating heat at roughly the output of a small electric space heater. This is why, paradoxically, you are not freezing right now despite the temperature. The work is keeping you alive. The moment you stop, the calculus changes. This is one of the great and terrifying truths of extreme cold travel. Movement is warmth and warmth is life, and therefore stopping for too long, in the wrong place without preparation, is a step toward death. The cold doesn't kill you directly in most cases. It kills you by taking away your ability to generate heat, or by overwhelming your body's heat generation capacity until your core temperature begins to drop. Hypothermia sets in not with a dramatic collapse but with a creeping cognitive fog, a strange and dangerous warmth, the infamous paradoxical undressing phenomenon, in which severely hypothermic individuals feel hot and begin removing their clothing, and eventually a quieting of all systems. You are not anywhere near that point. You are sweating slightly beneath your base layer and your core temperature is, if anything, running a degree or two higher than normal. But you understand, in a way that is no longer theoretical, why the margin matters. Why the system of layers and monitoring and constant self-assessment is not paranoia but arithmetic. Semyon stops at the top of a low ridge and waits for you to come alongside him. He points out across the open ground below, a broad, flat expanse of snow-covered steppe, pale and featureless in the starlight, extending to a dark tree line perhaps 3 kilometers distant. The wind, which has been absent since you left the edge of Yakutsk, is visible out there. You can see it moving the surface snow in long, horizontal sheets, a flowing ground blizzard that doesn't obscure the sky but turns the bottom meter of air into a river of fine, dry crystal. The temperature with wind chill across that open ground, Semyon indicates through gesture and your interpreter's quiet translation, will be considerably lower than the ambient -71. Wind strips the thin layer of warm air that your body holds just above the skin's surface, the boundary layer in the thermal physics terminology, and replaces it with cold, and the effect on perceived temperature is dramatic and nonlinear. You study the moving snow across the steppe. It is beautiful in the way that certain dangerous things are beautiful, precisely and specifically because of what it represents, not in spite of it. Here is the quirky fringe detail that floats to mind. Scientists studying cold acclimatization discovered in the 1960s that some populations exposed to consistent cold not only develop the hunting response in their extremities but also show elevated baseline metabolic rates. Essentially, their idle heat output is higher than that of non-cold adapted individuals. Some researchers have proposed that this represents genuine genetic adaptation over multiple generations, which would make the Saka and similar peoples among the very few human populations to have evolved measurable physiological responses to a specific environmental pressure within the last few thousand years. Historians and biological anthropologists still argue whether the degree of adaptation seen in cold climate indigenous peoples represents true genetic selection or is primarily the result of developmental acclimatization, the body learning during childhood, and the distinction matters enormously for how we understand human evolutionary plasticity. You file this away for later contemplation. Right now, Semyon is gesturing toward the open steppe with the particular economy of movement of someone who doesn't waste energy on unnecessary gestures. And the message is clear. We're going across. You tighten your face mask. Check your mitt liners. Lower your goggles slightly to make sure the seal is tight against your cheekbones. Semyon watches all of this with the patient attention of a flight instructor watching a student do a pre-takeoff checklist. And when you are done, he nods once, turns, and steps off the ridge into the wind. The cold out on the open steppe is a different animal entirely from the cold in the shelter of the large forest. It is not significantly colder in absolute terms, but the wind rearranges the experience so completely that the number on a thermometer becomes almost irrelevant. Wind at these temperatures doesn't just chill. It searches. It finds every gap in your system, the millimeter where your balaclava has shifted slightly away from your goggle frame, the point where your mitt cuff doesn't quite overlap your jacket sleeve, the tiny breathing gap in your face mask, and it inserts itself into those gaps with a kind of mechanical persistence that feels almost intentional. You pull your sleeves down, adjust your balaclava, keep walking. The sled's runners, on the hard wind-scoured snow of the steppe, actually move more easily than they did in the powdery forest snow. Less resistance. But the wind is hitting the broad flat surface of the sled from the side, creating a lateral push that you have to compensate for with your hip angle, and the fiberglass poles transmit this force directly into your harness in an irregular, tiring way. You learn to angle slightly into the wind, to let the sled's drag anchor you against the lateral push, to find the geometry that makes the whole system work as a unit rather than fighting itself. Your face, in the wind, is where the cold is most specific and most demanding. The neoprene face mask funnels your exhaled breath upward, and despite your goggles' anti-fog coating, the lenses are clouding at the edges. You tilt your head slightly. Clear. Fog again. Tilt. The rhythm of it becomes automatic. Somewhere beneath all the gear, beneath the monitoring and adjusting and breathing and walking, there is a quieter experience happening. The landscape is doing something to your perception that you didn't anticipate. The scale of it, the flat white immensity of the steppe under the star-crowded sky, the wind moving the snow in long silver tongues across the ground, the dark thread of the far tree line that seems to get no closer no matter how long you walk, produces a state of mind that isn't quite awe and isn't quite fear but is somewhere in the territory between them. A heightened simplicity. Every thought not directly related to the next step, the next breath, the next thermal adjustment, falls away of its own weight. The cold strips everything down to essentials. It is, in a very specific and involuntary way, clarifying. You pull the sled across the open steppe and the wind moves around you and the stars burn overhead and your body does its ancient, astonishing work of keeping itself alive. And for a long stretch of time you are aware of almost nothing except the squeak of your boots on the hard snow and the tension of the harness against your hips and the cold, always the cold, present and absolute and utterly indifferent, the oldest fact about this place. The one that was here long before any human being was and will remain long after. The tree line eventually arrives, the way things do in extreme environments, not gradually but suddenly, as if the distance finally relented all at once. The wind drops the instant you step into the shelter of the first larches. The contrast is so immediate and so physical that you actually stop walking for a moment, simply to register it. The cold is still the same cold, but the wind's absence transforms it from hostile to merely severe, which in context feels almost like stepping inside. Semyon stops beside you and says something to the interpreter. He says, "The forest is a wall. Learn to read walls." You look back at the steppe, at the ground blizzard still flowing across it, silver and endless, and then you turn and follow him into the trees. The sled needs to be repacked. You discover this approximately 40 minutes into the larch forest, when the terrain begins doing something that the relatively straightforward steppe crossing did not prepare you for. The ground under the snow is not flat. It is a subtle, constantly shifting topography of frozen hummocks, tussocks of grass and sedge that froze in place last autumn and are now buried under the snowpack, creating an irregular, unpredictable surface that tips and angles the sled in ways that shift its load with every few meters. A badly balanced sled on terrain like this doesn't just slow you down. It actively fights you, twisting in the harness, pulling sideways on one pole, then the other, exhausting your stabilizing muscles in a way that straight pulling never would. Semyon watches you wrestle with it for about 3 minutes before he holds up a hand. "Stop." He crouches beside the sled and begins pulling items out with the calm, methodical energy of someone who has repacked sleds in -71-degree cold enough times that the cold has simply become a neutral fact of the operation, like gravity. He does not hurry. Hurrying, in these temperatures, means sweating. Sweating means wet layers. Wet layers, at the end of the day when your exertion drops and your heat generation drops with it, means a serious and potentially catastrophic problem. Every operation out here is performed at exactly the speed it needs to be performed at and no faster. You watch him work and try to understand the logic. The heaviest items, fuel canisters, the dense brick of your emergency rations, the compact but substantial tent, go at the bottom and toward the front of the sled, close to the toe point where the poles connect. This keeps the center of gravity low and forward, which means the sled tracks straight and doesn't pendulum sideways when the terrain angles. Medium-weight items layer over that, the sleeping system, the stove, the cook kit, the food bag for the next 2 days. Light items and frequently needed things, your thermos, the repair kit, the emergency bivouac bag that you hope with considerable sincerity you will never need to use, go on top, accessible without unpacking the whole system. Everything is secured with a webbing net and 2 compression straps, tensioned evenly so the load doesn't shift. Semyon steps back, looks at the sled, adjusts one strap by perhaps 2 centimeters and stands. You clip back into the harness and take 3 steps. The difference is immediate and almost offensive in its clarity. Offensive because it means the previous 40 minutes of struggling were entirely unnecessary, a tax you paid on inexperience. The sled follows you. It doesn't fight. It doesn't lurch or twist. It simply comes along behind you with a steady, even pull that you distribute through your hips and feel almost as a rhythm rather than a resistance. "Better," says the interpreter, without being asked to translate anything. He has apparently developed an independent opinion. Reading the land you are learning is not a single skill. It is a family of related skills, layered one over another like the clothing system keeping you alive, each one necessary, none of them sufficient on its own. There is the macro-scale reading, looking ahead across hundreds of meters to identify the line of least resistance, the route that avoids the deepest drifts and the most severe hummock fields and the areas where the snow surface has that flat, matte quality that means unconsolidated powder beneath, the kind that swallows your boot to the knee and makes every step a small excavation. There is the medium-scale reading, the 20 or 30 meters immediately ahead, the specific obstacles and opportunities in your immediate path, the choice between going over a drift or around it. And then there is the microscale, almost unconscious reading that your feet begin to develop after a few hours, the way the snow sounds and feels slightly different under your boots when the surface is about to change, the way the resistance in the sled poles telegraphs information about the terrain the runners are crossing a half-second behind you. The Saka name for the skill of reading winter terrain is not a single word but a concept embedded in a cluster of related terms, each describing a different aspect of snow and ice knowledge. Semyon, walking ahead of you, is performing this reading continuously. You can see it in the small adjustments of his route, the way he angles left around a section of terrain that looks identical to you but apparently reads differently to him, the way he pauses briefly at a slight depression in the snow surface, studies it, and steps deliberately around its edge rather than across it. You follow his exact footsteps, which is the right protocol when traveling with someone who knows the terrain and you do not. His track is a series of already evaluated decisions. Every step he takes is a data point. You step where he steps. The larch forest has its own microclimate, distinct from both the open steppe and the exposed ridgelines. The trees, sparse here, the Siberian larch never growing in the dense packed stands of more southerly forests, partly because the shallow active layer of the permafrost limits root depth. So the trees space themselves widely to compete for the limited soil resources, break the wind without eliminating it, filter the starlight into long striped shadows across the snow, and create channels and clearings that funnel air movement in unpredictable directions. The snow under the trees is different from the snow in the open. Lighter, drier, less compacted, lying in feathery drifts caught by the outstretched bare branches above. In the clearings it is harder, wind-scoured, reliable. Between zones, transitional and treacherous. Semyon pauses at the edge of one such clearing and reaches into a pouch at his waist. Part of the doha, a beautifully functional garment that has multiple internal and external pockets arranged for exactly this kind of access while wearing heavy outer mitts, and produces what appears to be a short wooden stick with a flattened end. He kneels at the edge of the clearing and inserts the stick into the snow at an angle, withdrawing it, examining what it shows. Then he does it again 2 meters further along. Then again. Your interpreter explains. He is checking the snow depth and density profile across the clearing, using a probe that has been calibrated with small notches to indicate depth. In areas where the wind has scoured the surface hard, the snow may be shallow but extremely consolidated, fine for travel. In areas where drift patterns have deposited deep powder, the same surface appearance can conceal a meter or more of unconsolidated snow that will not support a loaded sled without the runner sinking and dragging to a halt. The probe tells you what your eyes cannot. He chooses a line across the clearing that tracks slightly to the left of the most direct route, following what turns out to be a slight ridge of consolidated snow. Identifiable, now that he points to it, by a barely perceptible difference in the snow surface's texture, a slight shininess against the matte of the surrounding powder. You cross the clearing on this line and the sled moves smoothly, runners skating rather than plowing. On the far side, you stop to drink. Drinking in this cold is a separate exercise in management. Your water bottles, even tucked inside your jacket against your body heat, have cooled considerably over the past 2 hours of travel. The water is not frozen, body temperature is sufficient to prevent that, but it is cold enough to lower your core temperature meaningfully if you drink a large quantity quickly. You drink slowly, in small sips, and you do not remove your mitts to handle the bottle. The bottle has a loop of cord through its lid that allows you to hook it and manipulate it through the mitts without bare finger contact with the metal. You drink what you need and return it to the inner pocket before it can cool further. Hydration in extreme cold is a chronic problem that kills people every bit as effectively as the cold itself, just more slowly and more subtly. The dry air requires your respiratory system to humidify every breath, which means you are losing moisture constantly just by breathing, far more than you would at normal temperatures and humidity levels. The cold suppresses your thirst sensation, a physiological quirk that researchers believe is connected to the redistribution of blood volume toward the core during cold exposure, which your body's fluid-sensing mechanisms misread as adequate hydration when it is not. The result is that you are almost certainly more dehydrated right now than you feel, and Semyon has already told you, through the interpreter, that you will drink on schedule regardless of thirst. Every 45 minutes. Every time. The Saka have been managing this problem for centuries with a suite of traditional practices that modern cold weather medicine has largely validated. Hot broths carried in insulated containers, the thermal equivalent of a modern vacuum flask, achieved historically through the use of multiple nested containers of birch bark with insulating material packed between them, provided hydration along with calories and warmth. The practice of eating snow for hydration, while intuitive, is actively counterproductive. It takes energy to melt snow in the stomach, cooling the core in the process, and in an environment where every calorie of heat generation is precious. Voluntarily burning energy to melt ice water in your gut is an expensive transaction. You don't eat snow. You drink the water you carried, warmed against your body, and you eat the small dense square of energy bar that Semyon produces from his own pouch and hands to you without comment. Tastes, in the cold, like almost nothing. The sense of taste is suppressed in extreme cold, one of those minor physiological oddities that you notice only when you are eating something that you know should taste like chocolate and peanut butter and instead tastes like a slightly sweetened piece of cardboard. You eat it anyway because the calories are not optional. The route ahead, according to the hand-drawn map that Semyon carries folded in an inner pocket, curves northwest for the next 8 kilometers before crossing a frozen tributary of the Lena River, a river crossing that will require its own set of ice-reading skills, and then climbs along gentle ridge to the first overnight campsite. 8 kilometers sounds manageable in the abstract. In the specific, in the dark, in the cold, pulling a 40-kilogram sled across frozen hummocks through a sparse larch forest, it is approximately 4 hours of sustained, careful work. You shoulder the harness and begin. The taiga at night, which is to say the taiga for the next 20 hours, has a quality of silence that is not merely the absence of sound but something more active, more present. Sound travels differently in extreme cold. The physics of it change as the air's density increases, and certain sounds carry impossible distances while others seem muffled and close. Your footsteps are very loud. The creak of the fiberglass poles in their fittings is very loud. Occasionally the larch trees produce a sound like a pistol shot as the sap inside them, which has long since frozen, contracts further in the cold and splits the wood from within. These thermal cracks are startling every time, even when you know they're coming. They happen without warning and without pattern. A single sharp report from somewhere in the dark, and then silence floods back in. Historians still argue about the degree to which the Saka's extraordinary relationship with this landscape represents a form of ecological knowledge that constitutes a distinct epistemology, a way of knowing the world that is fundamentally different from, and in some respects more sophisticated than, the scientific frameworks that external researchers have brought to bear on the same environment. What is not in dispute is that the accumulated practical knowledge embedded in Saka land use practices, travel routes, seasonal calendars, and terrain reading traditions represents the output of hundreds of years of field testing in conditions that provided immediate and lethal feedback for errors. The larch forest you are walking through has been read, interpreted, traveled, and known by Saka hunters and traders in ways that have no equivalent in the scientific literature. Semyon's probe stick is one small artifact of that tradition. There is, in the quirky margins of cold weather research, a documented phenomenon in which people who spend extended periods traveling in featureless or low-stimulus cold environments begin to develop a sensitivity to terrain and weather cues that they cannot fully articulate, a felt knowledge, a kind of proprioceptive attunement to the landscape that registers changes in snow surface or wind direction or air pressure before the conscious mind has processed them. Polar explorers have written about it. Indigenous hunters describe it as simply knowing. Researchers are genuinely uncertain whether this represents a genuine perceptual faculty being trained by necessity, a form of pattern recognition operating below conscious awareness, or simply the accrual of so many specific learned cues that the knowledge base becomes effectively encyclopedic. You are nowhere near that yet. You are at the stage of watching Semyon's feet and copying them. But something is beginning, a small, preliminary tuning. You notice, without quite deciding to notice, that the snow sound under your boots changed 2 steps ago. Slightly softer, slightly higher pitched, and you shorten your stride fractionally, test the surface with a bit less commitment before transferring your full weight, and the surface holds. You file this away without words, just as information, just as a small piece of the terrain entering you. The frozen tributary appears after what feels like both longer and shorter than 4 hours. Time moves strangely when there are no visual cues to mark its passage, no lightning or darkening of sky, no change in the quality of the cold. It is simply there. A break in the tree line, a smooth white corridor through the larch, the snow surface different, flatter, more reflective, slightly blue in the starlight, marking where the water is locked beneath. Semyon stops at the bank and spends 5 full minutes studying the crossing before he steps onto the ice. He moves methodically across the frozen surface of the tributary, perhaps 30 meters wide at this point, placing each foot with deliberate care, pausing every few steps to listen. The sound of ice under stress is distinctive, and while the tributary will be frozen to considerable depth at these temperatures, the current beneath can create variations in ice thickness that the surface gives no indication of. He is listening for any change in the quality of the sound his footsteps make, the particular resonance that indicates deep solid ice versus the more hollow sound of ice that is thick but has an air gap below from a dropping water level. He reaches the far bank, looks back, nods. You follow, stepping exactly in his tracks, feeling the fiberglass poles transmit the solidity of the ice through to your hands. The sled hisses across behind you, its runners marking 2 parallel lines in the surface that will be there until the spring thaw covers them. Records of your passage in a medium that keeps records. You step up onto the far bank and into the tree line, and Semyon is already moving again, northwest, uphill, toward the ridge and the camp that is waiting at its crest. The cold settles around you like a held breath. You walk. The pull uphill begins gently enough. The ridge that Semyon is navigating toward rises over approximately 2 kilometers of gradual, forested slope, nothing dramatic on a topographic map, the kind of elevation change that a trail runner would barely register on a warm afternoon in autumn. But a loaded sled on an uphill grade in -71-degree cold is a different equation entirely, and your body begins recalculating within the first 100 meters. The physics of it are straightforward and merciless. On flat ground, the primary resistance you are working against is friction between the sled runners and the snow surface, plus the inertia of the load. On an uphill grade, you add the full weight of the sled, 40 kilograms, working against you through gravity, and the steeper the grade, the larger the component of that weight you are directly opposing with your legs and hips and lower back with every single step. A 10-degree slope doesn't sound like much. Multiply it by 40 kilograms and 4 hours of cumulative fatigue and a caloric deficit that is already beginning to make itself known at the edges of your awareness, and it becomes something you feel in specific named muscles. Your quadriceps are the loudest. They have opinions. You lean further into the harness, shifting the load transfer from your shoulders down into your hips, which are better designed for sustained load bearing. Your stride shortens. Your cadence slows. You find the gear. Experienced hikers and sled pullers talk about finding the gear the way cyclists talk about selecting the right chainring, and it is the same principle, a pace and effort level that you can sustain for hours without blowing up. A metabolic cruise control that keeps you generating heat and moving forward without pushing your heart rate into a zone that demands more fuel than you can efficiently supply. Too slow and you cool. Too fast and you sweat, and sweat soaks layers, and soaked layers at the end of the day become a problem that Semyon has already described with the quiet specificity of someone recounting something he has watched happen to other people. You find the gear. It is slower than you want it to be. It is exactly as fast as it needs to be. Semyon, ahead of you, moves up the slope with a quality of motion that you spend a long time studying because there is nothing else to look at, and also because it is genuinely instructive. He does not appear to be working hard. He is not, of course. He has been doing this his entire life, and his cardiovascular system and musculature are calibrated to this specific task in ways yours are not. But the technique is also different from how you are moving. His upper body is almost completely still. His arms swing slightly, but his torso doesn't rotate, doesn't rock, doesn't waste energy in lateral movement. All the work is happening from the hips down in a compact, efficient transfer of force directly into forward motion. He is, in the original and most literal sense of the phrase, putting one foot in front of the other, and doing it with an economy that has no room for wasted movement. You try to replicate this. Your torso, you discover, has been rotating slightly with each step. A small, unconscious motion that feels natural but is burning energy on movement that goes nowhere. You quiet it. Your pace evens out. The sled continues its hissing conversation with the snow behind you. The forest on the ridge slope is older than the forest in the valley. The larch trees here are larger in diameter, their bark deeply furrowed, their bare crowns spreading wider against the star-filled sky. Some of them, Semyon indicates through gesture and the interpreter's relay, are several hundred years old. The Siberian larch is one of the longest-lived tree species in the boreal forest. Specimens of 400 years or more have been documented, and the ones on this slope have been standing since before the first Russian explorers pushed east into Yakutia in the 17th century. Watching the seasons turn and the temperatures plunge and the permafrost shift beneath their shallow roots without any particular concern for human chronology. The Russian arrival in Yakutia, which happened in earnest in the 1630s with the establishment of a fort at what would become Yakutsk, is one of the mainstream historical facts that defines this region's recorded history. The Cossack expeditions that pushed east across Siberia during the 17th century represent one of the most rapid territorial expansions in human history. A landmass roughly the size of the continental United States was nominally brought under Russian control within a few decades, though control is a generous term for what was initially a loose network of fortified trading posts separated by thousands of kilometers of wilderness. The Saka encountered these newcomers with a complex mixture of resistance, accommodation, and pragmatic adaptation that historians are still disentangling, and the imposition of the yasak, a fur tribute system that required Saka communities to deliver quotas of valuable pelts to Russian administrators, fundamentally restructured indigenous economic and social life in ways that played out over generations, none of which the larch trees on this slope noted with any particular interest. They simply grew and froze and thawed and grew again. You are perhaps halfway up the ridge when your left hip flexor decides to file a formal complaint. It is not an injury. It is fatigue of a specific and localized kind, the kind that settles into a single muscle group that has been working at an unfamiliar angle for an unfamiliar duration, and it announces itself as a deep, dull pull that is not yet painful but is clearly a precursor to painful if you ignore it. You do not ignore it. You stop briefly, carefully, aware that stopping means cooling, and shift your harness position slightly, redistributing the load transfer to bring your glutes more actively into the movement and take some of the demand off the hip flexor. This is the kind of micro-adjustment that experienced sled pullers make constantly and automatically, and that you are learning to make consciously, one lesson at a time. Semyon, who has stopped when you stopped without being asked, trail protocol, the lead traveler matches pace to the rear, watches you adjust the harness without comment. When you signal ready, he turns and continues up the slope. The silence up here is different from the silence in the valley. The trees are sparser, the wind has found its way up the ridge face, and there is a low, continuous whisper of moving air through the bare larch branches that gives the silence a texture, a frequency. Not loud enough to call it wind. Not still enough to call it quiet. Something in between, the forest breathing. It is somewhere in this middle section of the climb, in the specific altered state that sustained physical effort in extreme cold produces, that you begin to understand something about why every step costs triple the energy. And it is not only the grade, not only the sled weight, not only the cold's demand on your metabolic furnace. It is the snow itself. Snow is not a uniform medium. Anyone who has walked through it knows this vaguely, but pulling a loaded sled through it across varied terrain makes it specific and unavoidable. The hard, wind-scoured sastrugi of the open steppe offered low friction but high instability. The powdery forest snow offers high friction. The runners plow through rather than gliding over, requiring more force per meter of progress, but relatively predictable surface. The partially consolidated snow on the lower ridge was a middle ground. Up here, on the steeper upper slope where the wind comes over the crest and deposits driven snow in complex layered patterns, you are encountering something more complicated, wind slab, a layer of snow that has been compacted and sintered by wind into a hard, plate-like crust that sits atop softer layers beneath. Your boots punch through it with each step, breaking the crust, dropping your foot into the softer layer below, then requiring effort to extract it before the next step. The sled runners, wider than a boot, sometimes ride the crust and sometimes break through, and the transition between these two states creates an irregular, jarring pull in the harness that you cannot anticipate or rhythm your way through. You simply endure it. This is the part of extreme cold travel that the accounts in adventure books tend to aesthetize. finding language for the spiritual dimensions of physical suffering that makes it sound almost desirable from the comfort of a warm room. Out here, in the specific, it is not spiritual. It is mechanical. Your legs move. The sled follows. The crust breaks and reforms. Your hip flexor files an updated complaint. You move through the dark and the cold and the snow 1 meter at a time because stopping is not a meaningful option, and because the camp at the ridge crest has a stove and hot food and a sleeping system rated to -40, and because the body, presented with no reasonable alternative, continues. There is something clarifying about the removal of options you are discovering. On an ordinary day, the sheer number of available choices, routes through a city, meals to prepare, conversations to have, things to do or not do, creates a kind of cognitive weather that you move through without noticing it. Here, the choices have been reduced to almost nothing. Move or don't move. Stay warm or don't. Drink when Semyon indicates drinking time. Eat when Semyon produces food. Watch where you step. Follow the line. Everything else, every anxiety and ambition and unfinished thought that normally circulates through the background of consciousness, has been displaced by the simple, complete, demanding present tense of the work. This is, researchers who study extreme environment psychology suggest, part of what draws certain people repeatedly to places like this. Not masochism, or not only masochism, but a genuine hunger for the simplicity that physical extremity enforces. When survival is the project, everything else becomes optional, and the relief of that optionlessness is something that is difficult to find any other way. A peculiar kind of freedom purchased at considerable physical cost. The ridge crest arrives. It arrives the way the far tree line arrived on the step crossing. Suddenly, the grade leveling beneath your boots in a way you feel through the harness before you see it, the sled's weight shifting from pushing uphill against you to simply following behind you, the effort dropping in a single step from arduous to manageable. You walk 4 more steps onto the flat crest of the ridge and stop, and Semyon stops beside you, and for a moment you both simply stand there in the wind and look. The view from the ridge, if view is the right word for what is visible in starlight and the faint ambient luminescence of snow, extends in every direction across a landscape so large and so empty and so uniformly white and dark that it bypasses the visual processing centers that normally make sense of spaces and goes directly to something more primitive. This is not scenery. This is scale. The taiga stretches out below you in every direction, broken only by the pale ribbons of frozen watercourses and the occasional darker clearing, to a horizon that is everywhere and nowhere, because in the dark and the flatness the horizon is simply where the stars begin. The wind on the crest is consistent and direct, coming from the northeast, and the wind chill here is meaningful. You have been stationary for perhaps 90 seconds and you can already feel the heat equation shifting, the metabolic furnace still running hot from the climb, but the wind stripping the boundary layer from every exposed surface, the cold beginning to find the small gaps and margins of your system with renewed interest. Semyon has already identified the campsite, a shallow depression just below the crest on the leeward side, sheltered from the direct wind by the ridge itself, with 3 large trees positioned to break any eddying crosswind. He walks to it with the directness of someone who either scouted it previously or read it from the terrain so fluently that prior scouting was unnecessary. You follow. The depression is perhaps half a meter below the ridge surface, small enough that you would not have noticed it as significant, large enough that it drops the effective wind exposure by something Semyon estimates, through gesture, at roughly half. Half the wind, at these temperatures, is the difference between a campsite and a crisis. You unclip from the sled harness and your hips, released from the load, give a long structural sigh that you feel more than hear. The fiberglass poles retract and you pull the sled into the depression, positioning it as Semyon indicates, upwind of the tent site where it will act as an additional windbreak for the tent's entrance, and then you stand for a moment with your hands on your knees, breathing. The stars above the ridge crest are extraordinary. The Milky Way has shifted position in the sky during the hours you have been walking, tracking the rotation of the Earth with its usual indifference, and it now arches directly overhead in a band so dense and bright it seems almost close enough to be topographic rather than astronomical. You have seen the Milky Way before, from dark sky sites in deserts and on mountaintops. You have not seen it like this. The cold and the latitude and the total absence of any artificial light source within dozens of kilometers combine to produce a sky that looks, genuinely, like nothing available anywhere in the modern inhabited world. There is a quirkily documented atmospheric phenomenon specific to extreme cold environments. At temperatures below approximately -40, the moisture in exhaled breath sometimes freezes into tiny ice crystals before dispersing, creating a brief personal cloud of diamond dust, hexagonal ice platelets catching available light, that can produce a faint prismatic shimmer around a person's head for a fraction of a second after each exhale. At -71, this is not a sometimes. This is every breath. You have been generating tiny, momentary halos of frozen breath for hours without noticing them, too focused on the work of walking to observe yourself from the outside. Semyon notices you noticing the stars, and says something. The interpreter. He says his grandfather told him the cold nights are when the sky gets homesick for the earth and reaches down. The stars come closer. That is why they look brighter. You look at the sky for one more second. The cold agrees with the assessment. Then Semyon hands you a tent pole and the evening's actual work begins. Putting up a tent in -71 degrees Celsius is a timed event. Not officially. No one is holding a stopwatch. But the cold is keeping score, and the score is kept in the currency of dexterity. Specifically, how much of it you have left by the time the tent is standing, pegged, and guyed out against the wind. Dexterity at these temperatures is a resource that depletes faster than you expect and replenishes slower than you need. And every task that requires fine motor control is a withdrawal from an account whose balance you cannot directly observe until it is nearly empty. The tent itself is a four-season expedition model, low and aerodynamic, designed to shed wind and shed snow load and remain standing in conditions that would reduce a three-season hiking tent to a tangle of broken poles and collapsed nylon within minutes. Its poles are pre-bent and color-coded, which under normal circumstances would make assembly intuitive and quick. Under these circumstances, with your fingers inside 2 layers of mitts and the temperature stripping heat from every exposed surface and the wind on the ridge doing its level best to take the tent body out of your hands and redistribute it somewhere downslope, intuitive and quick are aspirational rather than descriptive. Semyon does not remove his outer mitts during tent assembly. He has developed, over decades, through a process of repetition that you are witnessing the endpoint of without having witnessed any of the learning, the ability to manipulate pole sections and clip attachments and guy-line knots through the thick reindeer hide mitts. His fingers inside reading the hardware by feel, the mitts becoming an extension of his hands rather than an impediment to them. You watch this for approximately 30 seconds before accepting that you cannot replicate it and adopting a different strategy. You work in bursts, pulling your liner glove hand briefly out of the outer mitt to accomplish a specific task. Clip a pole segment, thread a corner attachment, tie a guy line, and then returning your hand immediately to the warmth of the outer mitt and holding it against your core while feeling returns. 15 seconds of dexterous work. 30 seconds of warming. 15 seconds of work. 30 seconds of warming. The tent goes up in this rhythm, piece by piece, in the depression below the ridge crest, and it takes 3 times as long as it would take in any reasonable temperature, and it is exactly as fast as it is possible to do it. When the final guy line is staked, the snow stakes driven into the hard pack with a small mallet and then buried under additional snow scooped over them with a boot to increase their holding power, you step back and look at what you have built. It is not beautiful exactly. It is low and utilitarian and slightly asymmetrical from the outside. The windward face pulled taut by the guy lines, the leeward side relaxed and just barely rippling in the eddied wind behind the ridge. But it is standing. It is real. In the context of where you are and what the alternative is, it is the most important structure you have ever seen. Semyon is already clearing the snow from inside the tent entrance, a brief but necessary task. Any snow tracked inside the tent will melt from the stove's warmth and then refreeze when the stove goes out, creating an ice layer on the tent floor that will, over multiple nights, progressively worsen your sleeping conditions and your morning routine. Snow management inside the tent is not tidiness for its own sake. It is maintenance of a life support system. You both remove your outer boots at the entrance. They will live in the tent vestibule, not inside the sleeping area, where the temperature differential between the boot temperature and the inside air would cause condensation to form inside the boots, which would freeze overnight and make putting them on in the morning a significantly more complicated operation than it needs to be. And you crawl inside, pulling the sled's top bag of sleeping equipment and cook kit in behind you. The stove goes on first. This is not a luxury. At minus 71, your body has been running its metabolic furnace at high output for 4 hours, and while movement kept you warm, the cessation of movement means the furnace output must be compensated by external heat sources or your core temperature will begin declining at a rate that, while not immediately dangerous, will make the next several hours progressively less comfortable and eventually genuinely hazardous. The stove also melts snow for water. You will need to produce several liters tonight, both for dinner and for the preloaded bottles you will carry tomorrow, and it dries the moisture that has accumulated in your inner layers during the day's exertion, which is critical for tomorrow's warmth. The stove is a canister model designed for cold weather use, with a pressure regulator that compensates for the reduced vapor pressure of butane and propane mixtures at very low temperatures. A standard canister stove, the kind used for 3-season camping, would produce almost no output at minus 70 because the fuel cannot vaporize adequately in the cold. Cold-rated stoves either use different fuel blends, incorporate preheating elements, or, in Semyon's case, use the preferred traditional adjacent option for serious cold weather travel, a white gas stove, which burns liquid fuel pressurized manually with a pump and is significantly more reliable across the full range of extreme temperatures, though it requires more maintenance and more care in operation. The stove lights on the second attempt. The small blue flame at the burner head is, in the context of the cold and the dark and the howling theoretical temperature outside the tent walls, the most welcome thing you have seen all day. Within 10 minutes, the tent interior has risen from ambient, which is to say, roughly the same as outside, since the tent is not magically insulated, merely windproof, to somewhere around minus 20, which is still extremely cold by any ordinary measure, but which, after hours at minus 71, registers to your body as something approaching warmth. The human thermostat is radically contextual. You unzip your outer jacket. Dinner is the next operation, and it is worth dwelling on because food in extreme cold is not merely nutrition. It is fuel, literally and specifically, and the caloric mathematics of a day like today are not incidental. You have burned somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 calories today. This is not an estimate for dramatic effect. It is a reasonable range based on the documented caloric expenditure of sled pulling in cold environments, which has been studied with some rigor by military researchers and polar expedition physiologists interested in the question of how to keep people functional in extreme conditions. For comparison, a moderately active adult going about a normal day burns roughly 2,000 calories. You have spent 3 to 4 times that amount, primarily because your body has been simultaneously powering sustained muscular effort and running its thermogenic systems at elevated output to maintain core temperature in conditions designed to strip heat from you as fast as you can generate it. To replace 6,000 to 8,000 calories in a single evening meal is not feasible. Stomach capacity limits you. You will run a caloric deficit today and tomorrow and every day of this traverse, which is why your body composition will change noticeably over the 6 days regardless of how much you eat, and why the food you do eat is selected for maximum caloric density rather than any other quality. The dinner that Semyon produces from the food bag is, in this context, a masterpiece of engineering disguised as a meal. Rendered reindeer fat, solid at these temperatures and requiring the stove's heat to melt into a liquid, goes into the pot first. This is not a garnish or a cooking medium. It is the primary caloric payload of the meal, pure fat, which at 9 calories per gram is the most energy-dense food substance available, roughly twice the caloric density of carbohydrates or protein. The Saka have relied on rendered animal fat as a core dietary staple through winters for as long as anyone has been recording their foodways, and the nutritional logic of this is impeccable. In an environment that demands extraordinary caloric output, and where food must be carried on a sled, and therefore weight is a real constraint, fat is the most efficient way to pack energy into a manageable mass. Modern expedition nutritionists, working from first principles, have arrived at essentially the same conclusion that Saka food culture reached empirically centuries ago. Into the melted fat goes dried and pounded reindeer meat, Stroganina's traveling cousin, a form of preserved meat that has been dried and then cold pounded to break down the fibers and increase its surface area, making it reconstitute faster in hot liquid, along with dried berries, a handful of the dense buckwheat-like grain that has been a staple of Siberian diets since before recorded history, and several strips of what turns out to be dried fish from the Lena River, added almost as seasoning, their oils contributing additional fat calories to the mixture. The whole thing simmers for 12 minutes and becomes something that is technically a stew in the same way that a freight train is technically a vehicle. Accurate but underselling the reality. Tastes, in the cold, of warmth first and flavor second. Your body receives it with a gratitude that is not a metaphor but a physiological event. You can feel, within minutes of eating, the slight elevation of core comfort, the caloric input beginning to feed the furnace, the specific relief of a depleted system receiving supply. You eat 2 bowls. Semyon eats 3. The quirky footnote to extreme cold nutrition, which sits in the margins of polar medicine literature with the amused quality of facts that seem too specific to be true. The appetite suppression that accompanies altitude sickness, a well-documented phenomenon that complicates nutrition for high-altitude mountaineers, has no equivalent in extreme cold. The cold, if anything, drives appetite upward, not down. Researchers studying Inuit and Saka dietary patterns in deep winter have documented spontaneous caloric intakes of 5,000 to 7,000 calories per day in traditionally living subjects engaged in subsistence activities, the body's hunger signals accurately tracking its extraordinary energy demands. The idea that indigenous Arctic peoples were eating in ways that would seem extreme by modern sedentary standards is not a curiosity. It is a precise physiological response to a precise physiological situation. Historians still argue, incidentally, about the degree to which the disruption of traditional high-fat, high-calorie subsistence diets among indigenous northern peoples through the 20th century, the replacement of traditional foods with processed goods introduced through trade and resettlement, contributed to the documented rise in metabolic disorders in these communities, and the question sits at the intersection of nutritional science, colonial history, and public health in ways that resist simple answers. You finish your second bowl and hold the empty container in your lapped hands, feeling its residual warmth through your liner gloves. Outside, the wind has picked up. You can hear it against the tent's windward face, a steady, low-frequency pressure rather than a flapping, because the tent's aerodynamic profile is doing its job, and occasionally a stronger gust finds the ridge and presses the tent wall inward by a few centimeters before the guy lines take the load and the wall returns. The temperature outside has not changed. At -71, there is not much temperature left to drop. But the wind makes its own argument, and the tent makes its counter-argument, and for the moment the tent is winning. The sleeping system is a 3-component architecture. A closed-cell foam pad on the tent floor first, because foam does not compress under body weight and therefore retains its insulating thickness, unlike down or synthetic fill which will compress to almost nothing and provide no insulation between you and the frozen ground. Over that, an inner bag, a lightweight synthetic bag rated to -20, and then the outer bag, a massive expedition-grade down bag rated to -50. It's down fill certified for cold weather loft retention rather than the standard down used in recreational sleeping bags, which can lose significant loft at extreme temperatures as the fine structure of the down clusters becomes brittle and partially collapses. You sleep in your base layer and your liner gloves and your balaclava. Your boots are in the vestibule. Your water bottles are inside the sleeping bag with you, where your body heat will prevent them from freezing overnight. Your outer mitts are inside the bag too, at the foot end, where they will be dry and warm in the morning rather than frozen stiff. Before Semyon turns off the stove, banking the fuel, not wasting what is needed for morning, he does one final thing that you watch with attention because it is so deliberate and considered. He takes each of your inner boot liners, which have accumulated moisture from the day's sweating, and places them inside his own sleeping bag, at the foot end, body heat drying overnight. By morning they will be as dry as they were when new, ready to be placed back in the outer shells without the ice layer that would form if they were left in the vestibule. Small things. Constant, continuous small things. The whole system is nothing but small things, each one trivial in isolation, each one, in the aggregate, the difference between functioning and not functioning. The stove clicks off. The cold comes back into the tent, gradually but immediately, the temperature dropping from -20 toward the ambient in a curve that your sleeping bag will arrest at some point below -20 but above -50. Somewhere in the range where the bag's rated performance keeps your core stable and your sleep, if not warm in any conventional sense, at least adequate. You pull the bag's draft collar tight around your shoulders. The wind presses the tent wall. The stars outside. You cannot see them, but you know they are there, those campfires of the ancestors, burn on with their complete indifference to the cold, which is either comforting or alarming depending on the angle you take. You close your eyes. The silence inside the bag and the tent and the depression below the ridge is the deepest silence you have ever heard. And somewhere in the larch trees below, a thermal crack, a single clean pistol shot report, marks the cold contracting the wood of a tree that has been standing here for 300 years. You are asleep before the echo of it fades. You do not wake so much as surface. There is no gradual brightening of light, no birdsong, no ambient noise of a world resuming its activity. There is simply a moment when you are asleep and then a moment when you are not, and the thing that has roused you is not sound or light but cold. A specific, localized cold at the tip of your nose, the only part of your face not enclosed in the balaclava's fabric, which has been exposed to the tent's interior air all night and has registered the overnight temperature drop with complete and uncomfortable accuracy. You lie still for a moment, taking stock before moving. This is the correct protocol, and you have absorbed it from Semyon's example without being explicitly taught it. In extreme cold, the transition from horizontal to vertical is a thermal event that needs to be managed. Your sleeping bag has maintained your core through the night by trapping a volume of air warmed by your body heat, and the moment you begin moving you will disrupt that equilibrium. The air warmed by last night's stove has long since dissipated. The tent is, right now, approximately the same temperature as the outside, somewhere around -65, perhaps slightly warmer in the small enclosed volume, though not meaningfully so. Getting up means leaving the bag, and leaving the bag means committing immediately to full cold management mode, which means the stove needs to be running before the bag is fully vacated, not after. You reach an arm out. Slowly, the bag's zipper cold against your liner-gloved fingers, and find the stove by touch. Prime the pump. 3 strokes. Open the valve. Strike the igniter. The flame catches, and the tent has a future again. You give it 5 minutes before you sit up, using the time to pull on your mid-layer jacket inside the bag, warming it with trapped body heat before it goes onto your body rather than putting a cold garment on a warm body and forcing your warmth to compensate. Every layer goes on warm if at all possible. This is not a refinement. This is the system. Semyon is already sitting up on his side of the tent, pulling his inner boot liners from the foot of his sleeping bag where they have spent the night drying, pressing them with the flat of his palm to confirm their dryness, then beginning the methodical reverse of last night's undressing. He moves through the morning routine with the same unhurried efficiency he brings to everything, the economy of motion that you are beginning to recognize as the universal signature of someone who has learned to conserve energy in an environment that taxes every expenditure. Outside, the wind has dropped. You can tell from the tent wall, which is still and silent rather than pressed and whispering. The cold, without the wind, feels different, dense and complete, like a medium rather than a force. Breathable if carefully. The day's travel will be easier without wind, and more dangerous in a specific way. Still cold is quiet cold, and quiet cold does not announce itself. It simply takes. Breakfast is the stove's second argument for its own necessity. Hot water goes in first. You melt snow in the pot, a slow process that produces a dispiriting quantity of water from what seemed like a generous amount of snow, because snow at these temperatures is extraordinarily dry and low density, with a snow-to-water ratio that can run as high as 20-to-1. This is the physical reality behind the survival rule about not eating snow for hydration. It would take an enormous metabolic cost to melt enough of it to stay hydrated, and the cold liquid produced would further chill your core in the process. Into the hot water goes a dense mixture of oats, rendered fat, dried berries, and powdered whole milk. A combination that reads as roughly 2,000 calories in a single bowl and that has the thick, almost adhesive consistency of something designed by an engineer rather than a cook, which is accurate because it was. You eat it because you need it and because, in the cold, the warmth it delivers to your core is its most important quality by a significant margin. Flavor is a secondary specification. Semyon eats his with the quiet satisfaction of someone for whom this meal is entirely normal, which it is. He has been eating variations of this breakfast in conditions like these for 50 years. While you eat, he talks. This is something he has not done much during the travel itself, conservation of breath and energy, and also, you suspect, a preference for attention over speech in terrain that demands attention. But in the relative shelter and warmth of the tent, with food in hand and the day not yet begun, Something loosens and words come. Your interpreter translates in fragments, catching up in clusters. He is talking about the Saka, about his people. The Saka are, by any measure, one of the most remarkable cultures in human history, and the reason they are not more widely known outside of Russia and a small circle of Northern Studies academics is primarily a function of geography rather than significance. They number roughly 500,000 people today, a population that has survived epidemic disease, Tsarist conquest, Soviet collectivization, and the particular cultural pressures of being an indigenous people surrounded by a larger state with its own ideas about how everyone should live, and they have maintained a cultural identity of extraordinary richness and resilience through all of it. The Saka language belongs to the Turkic family, a linguistic lineage that connects it, distantly, to Turkish, Uzbek, Kazakh, and a dozen other languages spoken across a vast arc from Istanbul to western China, and its presence this far north is itself a piece of historical evidence for the migration story that brought the Saka's ancestors up from the southern steppes. The language is remarkable for several reasons, one of which Semyon demonstrates by producing, in the space of about 30 seconds, 6 different words for specific conditions of snow and ice that have no single word equivalents in Russian or English. There is a word for the kind of ice that forms on rivers when the temperature drops suddenly and the surface freezes while the current beneath is still moving fast, producing a sheet with a characteristic rippled underside. There is a word for the snow surface condition created specifically by a thaw followed by a refreeze, which produces a breakable crust over softer layers, the condition that makes travel exhausting in a specific and predictable way. There is a word for the quality of cold that produces diamond dust in the air, distinct from the word for ordinary cold. Language shapes perception, the linguists argue, a claim contested in its strong form but intuitively reasonable in its weak form, and a language with this many specific terms for snow and ice conditions is a language designed, at least in part, for reading this landscape with the precision that survival demands. Semyon's grandfather, he says through the interpreter, knew 47 distinct terms for ice conditions on the Lena River alone. This knowledge was not academic. It was navigational. Knowing the specific word meant knowing the specific condition, and knowing the specific condition meant knowing whether the ice would hold a man, a sled, a dog team, or nothing at all. 47 ways of knowing whether you would fall through. The reindeer arrive in his conversation next, and in Saka life the reindeer cannot be separated from the cold any more than the cold can be separated from the landscape. The Yakutian reindeer herding tradition, distinct from but related to the reindeer cultures of the Sami in Scandinavia and the Nenets further west in Siberia, has shaped Saka material culture, economy, and spiritual life for as long as the Saka have been in this landscape. The reindeer provides almost everything. Its hide, processed in specific ways depending on the intended use, provides material for clothing, footwear, tent coverings, harnesses, and a dozen other applications. The doha that Semyon is wearing, the reindeer hide coat that you have been watching and admiring since Yakutsk, is constructed with the fur facing inward, trapping warm air against the body, and the hide facing outward, providing wind resistance and durability. The specific preparation of the hide involves a multi-stage process of scraping, softening, and sometimes smoking that produces a material of extraordinary flexibility even at these temperatures, a critical property, because stiff material at -70 is cracked material, and cracked material lets in wind. The reindeer's fat, as you have already discovered at dinner, is its caloric gift. The reindeer sinew provides thread, extraordinarily strong, naturally slightly elastic, and capable of threading through a bone needle with the same facility as modern synthetic thread. The reindeer's antler provides tool handles, needle cases, toggles for fastenings, and material for the kind of small, functional carved objects that Saka craftspeople have produced for generations. The reindeer's bone provides marrow, which is dense with fat and micronutrients, and the bones themselves, cracked and boiled, produce a broth that is simultaneously hydration, calories, and warmth. The relationship between the Saka and the reindeer is not, however, purely utilitarian, and Semyon is emphatic about this in a way that the interpreter conveys with some effort, as though the concept is important enough to require precision. The reindeer is a relative, not a metaphorical relative, not a symbolic relative, in the Saka cosmological framework, which is rooted in the shamanistic tradition called Ai. an indigenous spiritual system that has persisted through Orthodox Christian conversion during the Russian period and Soviet-era suppression and contemporary secularization in various degrees of synthesis and survival. The relationships between humans and the animals they depend upon are reciprocal and obligatory in ways that have specific ritual and practical expressions. You do not take from the reindeer without acknowledgement. You do not waste what the reindeer provides. The animal's death is not a transaction but an agreement, and the agreement has terms. This is not sentimentality. It is, in a very practical sense, a sustainability framework that evolved because populations that violated it, that overhunted, that wasted, that extracted without reciprocity, did not survive in a landscape where the margin for error is this thin. The spiritual language encodes ecological necessity, the way much traditional knowledge encodes practical information in forms that are memorable, transmissible, and resistant to casual dismissal. Historians still argue about the degree to which Saka spiritual practices, including the complex shamanistic traditions that have been partially documented and largely misrepresented by outside observers since the 17th century, represent continuous indigenous development versus the result of synthesis with other northern cultures encountered during the migration period. The question matters because it bears on how we understand cultural resilience, whether the Saka brought their spiritual framework with them from the south and adapted it to the north, or whether the north itself shaped the framework from the ground up. What is not disputed is that the Saka shamanic tradition, centered on spiritual practitioners called Oyun for men and Yudigin for women, represented the primary framework for understanding and mediating the relationship between human communities and the forces, spirits, and entities of the natural world. The permafrost itself, in traditional Saka cosmology, is not inert geology but inhabited landscape, the dwelling place of spirits whose goodwill or hostility could determine the success of a hunt, the safety of a journey, the health of a herd. Semyon pauses here and says something that the interpreter hesitates over before translating. He says, "Before we left Yakutsk, he made an offering at the tree at the edge of the city, a piece of ribbon tied to a branch, an acknowledgement that we were entering something larger than ourselves and asking permission to pass through. You think about this. You did not see him do it. You were struggling with your goggles in the cold." He says he does this every time. Every single time for 50 years. The Yakutian horse enters the conversation as you are finishing the last of the morning tea, a black, strong brew that Semyon produces from a small packet, and that is, at this moment, the best tea you have ever tasted because of what it is and where it is, and the horse, like the reindeer, is both a practical and a spiritual presence in Saka life. The Yakutian horse is one of the most physiologically extreme domestic animals on the planet. A compact, thick-set creature, shorter and stockier than most horse breeds familiar to people outside the region. It has evolved or been selected, the distinction being one of those things that historians and biologists argue about, a suite of cold adaptations that allow it to live outdoors year-round in Yakutian winters without shelter, without supplemental feed, without any of the infrastructure that horses in temperate climates require. Its coat grows to an extraordinary thickness in winter, with an underlayer of dense wool-like fiber beneath longer guard hairs that together create an insulating system competitive with the finest expedition sleeping bags by volumetric comparison. Its legs are short, reducing heat loss from the extremities. Its hooves are exceptionally hard, and its technique for finding food beneath deep snow, a behavior called cratering, in which the horse uses its hooves to break through the snow crust and excavate the frozen vegetation beneath, is observed in other horse breeds only in mild winters and never at anything like the depth and persistence the Yakutian horse manages at -50 and below. There is a quirky biological footnote to the Yakutian horse's cold adaptations that surfaces occasionally in popular science writing. Genetic analysis of the breed has identified specific variants in genes related to thermogenesis, the biological process of heat generation, and peripheral circulation that are not present in other horse breeds, and appear to be genuine adaptive mutations, some of which have parallels in the cold adaptation genetics of woolly mammoths, whose remains are found with some regularity in the Yakutian permafrost. Whether this represents convergent evolution towards similar solutions to similar problems, or some more direct genetic legacy from the mammoth era through the horses that coexisted with mammoths in this landscape, is a question that genomic researchers are actively and enthusiastically disputing. Semyon has owned horses his entire adult life. Not for riding primarily, but for the same reason his ancestors kept them, for the meat, the fat, the companionship, and the cultural continuity they represent. The horse in Saka tradition is associated with the upper world, with positive spiritual forces, with summer and warmth and the return of the sun. The reindeer is associated with the north, with endurance, with the cold and the dark and the ability to navigate them. Together, in the Saka symbolic framework, they hold the poles of existence, the warmth that life reaches toward and the cold that life is always moving through. You finish your tea. The stove has done its work. The tent interior is perhaps -15, which your body now reads as comfortable, a recalibration that has happened without your noticing. The cold has shifted your baseline, and you are operating on a new scale. Outside, the day is beginning in the way Yakutian winter days begin. Not with dawn, not yet, but with a barely perceptible softening of the darkness in the south, a pre-dawn hesitation in the sky that suggests the sun is somewhere below the horizon, considering whether the effort is worthwhile. In an hour, perhaps, there will be enough light to travel by. In 2 hours, the sun will appear, briefly, low, golden, and useless for warmth, and you will walk in its thin light for the few hours it is above the horizon before the dark returns and the stars reassert their campfire village above the taiga. You begin the process of packing, reversing last night's unpacking in the same methodical order, everything going back to its designated place in the sled because designated places are not a preference but a system, and systems in extreme environments are not organizational niceties but the accumulated wisdom of people who learned, expensively, what happens when things are not where you expect them to be when you need them in the cold and the dark with cold-thickened fingers and a tired brain. Semyon breaks down the tent poles with the same manipulation technique. He assembled them with each segment collapsing and sliding back into the stuff sack with a practiced inevitability. You roll the tent body, pressing out the air carefully. A tent rolled with air trapped inside is a tent that will not compress into its stuff sack, and a tent that will not compress into its stuff sack is a problem at -70 in the wind with your hands beginning to go. The sled is loaded. The harness is clipped. The poles are seated in their fittings. You look back at the depression below the ridge crest. There is almost no evidence that you were there. The tent stakes pulled cleanly from the hard snow, the floor impression already beginning to drift over in the slight overnight wind. In a day, perhaps 2, there will be nothing. The cold keeps its own counsel about who passes through. Semyon steps up onto the ridge crest, looks north, looks at the sky in the south where the pre-dawn hesitation is now a definite lightning, looks at you. He says something. The interpreter. He says, "Yesterday you walked like someone who was afraid of the cold. Today you will walk like someone who respects it. There is a difference." You consider this for a moment, standing on the ridge with the weight of the sled in the harness at your hips and the cold around you and the larch forest descending below into the dark. Then you step forward into the second day. The second day begins in a different body. Not a better body necessarily, though you will discover specific ways in which it is better. Mostly it is different, recalibrated by yesterday's experience in ways that are physiological and neurological and something else that doesn't have a clean scientific name, a kind of cellular familiarity with the cold that your body has been building during the night the way it builds antibodies. Quietly and without announcement, until you step out onto the ridge in the pre-dawn dark and find that the cold is still the cold but your relationship to it has shifted by some small but meaningful degree. The muscle soreness is the most obvious physical fact of the morning. Your quadriceps, which filed their complaint on yesterday's uphill, have overnight drafted a more comprehensive document. Your hip flexors have co-signed it. Your lower back, which you did not hear from much yesterday, has apparently been composing a separate letter. All of this is familiar, the second-day soreness of any sustained physical effort, the muscle's response to microdamage from unaccustomed load, the inflammatory process that will fade over the following days as adaptation begins, but that makes the first hour of movement today a specific and instructive experience. The instruction is this: warm up slowly. In ordinary cold weather exercise, this is standard advice. In -71, it is not advice but physiology. Cold muscles are literally stiffer than warm muscles. The viscosity of the fluid in muscle tissue increases at lower temperatures. The collagen in tendons and ligaments becomes less elastic. The whole mechanical system requires several minutes of gentle, progressive loading before it can handle the stresses of full effort without significantly elevated injury risk. You move down the first slope of the ridge at 3/4 of yesterday's pace, feeling the soreness work through and the tissues slowly warm, the movement itself generating the heat that the movement requires, a bootstrapping process that takes about 20 minutes to fully resolve. By the time you reach the valley floor, you are walking. The forest here is different from the ridge forest. Denser, the larch trees growing in the wind shelter of the valley walls. Their trunks thicker, their bare branches interlacing overhead into a dark tracery against the slowly brightening southern sky. The light, when it comes, enters the valley obliquely, filtering through the tree lattice in long pale shafts that illuminate the hanging ice crystals in the air, the diamond dust of your breath and Semyon's breath and the ambient moisture the cold has frozen out of the air itself. And the effect is of walking through a cathedral that has been built from winter itself. Structural cold and structural light arranged into something that is not quite beauty and not quite threat but partakes of both equally. Semyon sets a slightly faster pace today. Not dramatically faster. You would not notice the difference if you were fresh. But your body, which is not fresh, notices it after about an hour as a gentle but persistent additional demand on the cardiovascular system that keeps your heart rate just slightly higher than yesterday's comfortable cruise. This is deliberate, you understand. He is calibrating to what you can manage on a second day, accounting for your soreness and fatigue, while also pushing you toward the slightly elevated effort that will produce warmth and forward progress without blowing up your reserves for the day's later hours. You think about this calibration, the way he reads your capacity and adjusts without asking, without discussion, entirely through observation, and it occurs to you that this is another form of the terrain reading skill applied to a different medium. He is reading you the way he reads the snow surface, looking for the texture that indicates what's beneath, adjusting the route accordingly. The route today will cover approximately 14 kilometers, according to the map, with 2 significant elevation changes, 1 more frozen river crossing, and a long open section across a high plateau in the early afternoon, the heart of the day, when the sun will be at its maximum height, which is to say roughly 8 degrees above the horizon, which is to say nearly useless for warmth but providing enough light to see by without headlamps. You walk. It begins around the 3rd hour. You notice it first as a thought that arrives slightly too fully formed, not the effortful construction of deliberate thinking but something that seems to surface complete, as though it had been assembled somewhere below conscious awareness and is simply being delivered upward. You are thinking about a conversation you had 3 years ago with a friend in a coffee shop in a city that is currently approximately 6,000 kilometers away, a conversation so minor that you would not have said yesterday or last week that you remembered it at all. But here it is, complete and detailed, the specific quality of the light through the window, the grain of the wooden table, the precise words of a sentence spoken and forgotten years before. You note this with mild interest and keep walking. 20 minutes later, something similar. An image, not quite a memory, the face of someone you knew in childhood, resolved in your mind's eye with a clarity and detail that photographs of that person do not contain. You look at it for a moment, observe its vividness, let it go. Then comes the first one that stops you. You are walking through a section of the forest where the larch trees have thinned enough to open a view across a shallow frozen lake to the north, and in your peripheral vision, to the left of the lake and perhaps 200 meters away, there is movement. Not wind movement, not the subtle drift of surface snow, but the specific lateral movement of something animal-sized moving through the tree line at the lake's far edge. You stop, turn, look directly. There is nothing there. You stand for 4 seconds, 5, staring at the tree line. The cold presses in around your stillness. Nothing moves. Semyon has stopped when you stopped and is watching you with the patient attention he applies to everything. He does not look toward the tree line. He looks at you. "I thought I saw something," you say, and the interpreter translates. Semyon nods slowly, says something. The interpreter. He says, "Yes, that starts today. It will get more interesting." What is happening in your brain is a function of several overlapping processes, and the sleep deprivation component is the most straightforward to explain. You slept last night. Genuinely slept, deeply and without interruption from the moment your eyes closed to the moment the cold tip of your nose woke you. But the sleep you got, in a tent at minus 65 degrees in a sleeping bag that required your unconscious body to maintain certain positions to keep the draft collar sealed, was not the same sleep you get in a heated bedroom in a comfortable bed. The sleep architecture was different. More time in lighter stages, less restorative slow-wave sleep, a body that spent a meaningful portion of the night doing thermal management work even while the conscious mind was offline. You woke rested relative to what you would feel without any sleep, but running a deficit relative to what full restoration requires. 2 nights of this will be fine. Your brain can compensate for moderate sleep deprivation with only minor degradation of higher cognitive function. 3 nights is where things begin to get genuinely interesting. You are on day 2. The cold has its own cognitive effects, separate from sleep deprivation, and they are more insidious because they are harder to notice. Cold causes a general slowing of neural processing. The same way cold increases the viscosity of muscle fluid, it slightly reduces the efficiency of synaptic transmission, the electrochemical communication between neurons. This is reversible and modest at the temperatures your core has been maintained at, but it is not zero, and it combines with the sleep deficit to produce a cognitive state that is subtly but genuinely altered. Reaction times are fractionally longer. Pattern recognition is fractionally less reliable. The boundary between clearly perceived sensory input and plausibly perceived sensory input is fractionally less distinct. Fractional does not mean negligible. In a context where the information your senses provide is critical to your navigation and safety decisions, fractional degradation matters. The peripheral vision anomaly, the movement that wasn't there, is almost certainly a combination of low-light pattern recognition operating on ambiguous input and a brain that is running slightly below its normal filtering capacity. The large tree shadows in peripheral vision are complex and irregular, and a slightly tired, slightly cold brain will, with somewhat higher probability than usual, apply its pattern recognition capacity and find a movement in the shadows that the conscious mind then promotes to a perceived event. This is not alarming. It is informative. It is your cognitive system telling you its current operating condition. The more interesting effects come later in the afternoon. You are crossing the high plateau, the open section that the map warned about, approximately 4 kilometers of exposed ground above the tree line. The wind here moderate and steady from the northwest, the snow surface hard and reliable. The horizon in every direction a clean flat line where white ground meets blue-black sky, and the light, such as it is at its maximum. The sun has crept up to its 8-degree elevation in the south and is producing a low, warm orange illumination that lies almost horizontally across the snow surface, throwing every small imperfection and irregularity into sharp shadow. The landscape in this light is hallucinogenic in the literal photographic sense. The contrast is extreme, the shadows deep, the lit surfaces almost incandescent, and your visual system, designed for a world of more moderate contrast, struggles slightly to calibrate. You have been walking for 6 hours. Somewhere in the 4th kilometer of the plateau crossing, the distance begins to behave strangely. The far tree line, the northern edge of the plateau, where the descent begins, appears to be where it should be according to the map, approximately 1 kilometer ahead. But as you walk, it does not get closer in the way that objects are supposed to get closer as you approach them. It maintains its apparent distance with a persistence that is geometrically impossible and subjectively maddening. Intellectually, that you are moving, because the sled is hissing behind you and your legs are moving beneath you and the near-ground features are passing underfoot. But the far tree line simply stays far. This is a documented perceptual phenomenon in flat, featureless, high-contrast landscapes. Polar explorers and desert travelers both report it, and it is related to the brain's use of size and overlap cues to estimate distance in the absence of the normal environmental complexity that provides accurate depth perception. On a flat white plateau with a sharp tree line and no intermediate features, the normal depth cues are absent and the visual system defaults to a kind of flat, map-like representation of space that doesn't properly encode the distance to far objects. You know this. You tell yourself you know this. The tree line continues to not get closer. Your brain, in its current slightly sleep-deprived and slightly cold-slowed state, offers a helpful alternative interpretation. Perhaps you are not moving. Perhaps you are walking in place on a surface that is scrolling beneath you, a treadmill of frozen ground, and the real world is stationary around you. This thought arrives with an unsettling quality of plausibility. You focus on the sled, which is physically present and physically moving. You focus on the ground directly beneath your boots, each step advancing you by a measurable distance onto snow that has not been stepped on yet. You count steps for a while, converting them to meters, meters to the distance you know remains to the tree line. The counting helps. It is an anchor, something concrete and sequential to hold on to in a cognitive environment that is becoming gradually and interestingly less reliable. Semyon, ahead of you, walks with the same unhurried consistency he has maintained for 2 days. He does not appear to be experiencing the distance anomaly, or if he is, it is so familiar that it has become simply a feature of the landscape rather than a cognitive event. You watch his back and match his pace and keep counting steps. The quirkily documented aspect of cold-induced perceptual changes is that they have a consistent subjective character across different individuals in different cold environments, a kind of universality to the altered state that suggests it is genuinely a product of the physiological conditions, rather than individual psychology. Polar explorers' journals from the 19th century era of Antarctic and Arctic exploration describe, across multiple accounts written by people who could not have read each other's unpublished diaries, the same specific hallucination types, peripheral movement in static environments, distance anomalies on flat terrain, and, most famously, the third man phenomenon, in which travelers in extremis report the distinct and vivid perception of an additional unseen presence accompanying them, a companion who is not there but who feels more real than the surroundings. Historians still argue about the third man phenomenon and its causes, whether it represents a genuine neurological event, a psychological coping mechanism, a dissociative response to extreme stress, or simply the confabulation of tired brains seeking social comfort in isolation. But the accounts are remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries and physical conditions. You are not at the stage of the third man. You are at the early stages of the perceptual loosening that, if conditions continue, might eventually lead there. For now, you have peripheral movements that resolve to nothing, a distance anomaly on the plateau, and a memory from 3 years ago delivered with inappropriate vividness in the middle of a large forest. And something else, something harder to name. A quality of presence to the landscape that is not quite the sense of being watched, which would be threatening, but is closer to the sense of being in the company of something very large and very old that is aware of you in the way that weather is aware of things, not with attention exactly, but with a kind of inclusive indifference that is somehow not the same as being ignored. The taiga around you, the sky above, the cold through which you move, these have acquired, over 2 days of continuous immersion, a character that they did not have from the airplane window or on the map or in any of the reading you did before you came. The cold has become specific. The landscape has become specific. And you have become, in some way that will take longer to understand than this journey allows, specific to it. A small, warm, moving thing in an enormous cold stillness, known to it the way a stone in a river is known to the water that passes around it. You walk across the plateau. The tree line, when it finally arrives, and it does arrive, the counting confirms it step by counted step, arrives with the sudden completeness of all arrivals out here. One moment it is ahead of you. The next moment you are in it. The trees closing around you on both sides, the wind dropping, the contrast softening from the plateau's extremity to the forest's more moderate chiaroscuro. You stop inside the first trees and look back. The plateau extends behind you, pale and immense, the low sun painting it in its flat orange light, the wind moving the surface snow in long transparent sheets a few centimeters above the ground. Your tracks cross it from south to north, 2 boot prints and 2 sled runner lines, very small, very straight, extending back to where the southern tree line is a dark smudge at the limit of visibility. The smallness of the tracks against the scale of the plateau is, right now, the most honest summary of the situation available. A small warm animal crossed a large cold place and arrived, briefly, at shelter. This has been true in this landscape for thousands of years. You turn back into the forest. The camp tonight is 3 kilometers ahead, according to Semyon's indicated direction. A known site, used by hunters and travelers on this route for generations, with a permanent shelter frame of larch poles where the tent can be erected with better wind protection than last night's ridge, and a cache of dried wood left by previous travelers according to the mutual aid tradition of the Zimniki routes, where those who pass leave resources for those who follow, because everyone on these routes is, at some point, the person who follows. 3 kilometers, an hour, perhaps, in the forest. You clip back into the harness. The weight of the sled settles against your hips with the familiarity of 2 days. It is no lighter, but your body has developed a relationship with the load, has learned its specific weight and momentum and the way it communicates through the poles, And this familiarity is itself a form of competence, a knowing that lives in the muscles rather than the mind. Somewhere behind you, in the middle of the plateau you just crossed, the wind is already beginning to soften your tracks. By morning they will be gone. On the third morning you wake before Semyon. This has not happened before. Both previous mornings he was already moving when consciousness found you, already priming the stove, already processing the transition from horizontal to vertical with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom morning in extreme cold holds no psychological resistance, only operational sequence. This morning the tent is dark and still, and his breathing on the other side of the sleeping space is the slow, deep rhythm of genuine sleep, and you lie in your bag for a moment registering this small reversal. You prime the stove yourself. 3 strokes of the pump. Open the valve. Strike the igniter. The flame catches. You feel, in this small act, something that you will spend a long time afterward trying to describe accurately and never quite managing. It is not pride exactly, though there is something of that in it. It is more like recognition, the sensation of a capability that has been transferred, not taught in the abstract but absorbed through proximity and repetition and necessity, now operating on its own without the scaffold of instruction. You know how to do this. Not because someone explained it, but because you have watched and done and adjusted and done again in conditions that made each repetition consequential. The knowledge sits in your hands as much as your head. It is a different kind of knowing from the kind that lives only in language. Semyon opens his eyes, registers the lit stove, and closes them again for 30 more seconds. When he opens them the second time, there is something in his expression that is not quite a smile. The cold has made his face economical with expression as it does, but that occupies the same functional territory. He says something. The interpreter, also waking, translates after a moment. He says, "Now you understand what cold teaches. You make the tea." Day 3's route is the longest single segment, 15 kilometers across terrain that Semyon has described, through the interpreter, as mixed. Mixed, in his vocabulary, turns out to mean a specific and demanding sequence of surface types. Lake ice to riverine forest to open heath to a long frozen river corridor, and then a final push to the third campsite at a bend in the river where a tributary junction creates a natural, wind-sheltered hollow. 15 kilometers in these conditions is a full day's work that will extend into the evening dark regardless of how efficiently you move. But something has changed in your body's relationship with the work. The change is subtle and structural, not dramatic. Your legs do not hurt less, they hurt, if anything, more, the cumulative damage of 2 days registering in the specific, differentiated vocabulary of muscles that have been asked to do unusual things for sustained periods. Your caloric deficit has deepened. Your sleep quality, while adequate for survival, has not been the restorative kind that normally processes the previous day's physical output and sends you into the next day rebuilt. By every measurable metric of physical readiness, you are less prepared for today's 15 kilometers than you were for day 1's shorter segment. And yet, the movement has become something different from what it was. On day 1, each step was a conscious decision, a small act of will performed against the resistance of the cold and the weight and the strangeness of the whole enterprise. By the end of day 1, that conscious quality had softened slightly. By the end of day 2, it had softened further. This morning, clipping into the harness and stepping onto the lake ice, the movement happens with a quality of simply happening, the body doing what the body now knows how to do without requiring the conscious mind to authorize each repetition. This is the shift that long-distance travelers in extreme environments describe, and that is difficult to convey to people who have not experienced it. The body, given sufficient repetition under conditions that make error costly, develops a kind of operational intelligence that runs below conscious awareness, not unconscious in the sense of unaware, but subconscious in the literal sense of running below the threshold of deliberate thought. Efficient in a way that deliberate thought never quite achieves, because deliberate thought is always slightly late, always responding to what has already happened rather than integrating with what is currently happening. You are not yet good at this. You are at the beginning of the beginning, but you are not where you were. Semyon notices. He says nothing, but his pace, which has been calibrated since Yakutsk to something slightly slower than his natural rate, a courtesy to your inexperience that you recognized on day 1 and have not mentioned, shifts fractionally upward. Not enough to tax you. Enough to acknowledge that the tax has changed. The frozen river corridor arrives in the early afternoon, which is to say, in what would be early afternoon by the clock, though the light is already making its familiar descent toward the horizon when you reach it. The Lena River system's tributaries ramify across this landscape like the branching of a tree seen from above, each smaller river feeding the next larger one, all of them frozen now to depths that vary from 1 meter to 3 meters depending on their width and current velocity and the specific temperature history of this winter. The one you are entering, a tributary perhaps 60 meters wide, its ice surface the dull gray-white of old, deep frozen river ice rather than the glossy blue-white of recently frozen lake ice, runs roughly northwest, which is your direction of travel, and its surface offers the lowest resistance traveling of anything you have encountered. The ice is hard and smooth, the sled runners finding almost no friction, the work dropping to something that feels, after 2 days, almost like rest. River ice has its own reading, distinct from lake ice and distinct from land-based snow travel, and Semyon's attention on the river is of a different quality from his attention in the forest. More distributed, less focused on the immediate footfall, ranging further ahead and to the sides in a continuous scanning that you have learned to recognize as the behavior of someone processing a large and continuously updated information field. The things he is reading, the color of the ice surface, which varies in ways that correspond to variations in thickness and internal structure, the presence or absence of frost heave, the buckled, pressure-ridged ice formations that indicate areas where freeze expansion has pushed the ice surface up, often accompanied by weakness in the surrounding area. The snow cover on the ice, where present, which can insulate the ice and prevent it from reaching full freeze depth, creating pockets of anomalously thin ice beneath an innocent-looking snow surface. The banks, the way the snow lies against the shore ice tells you about the temperature history and current stability of the marginal ice, which freezes last in autumn and thaws first in spring and is therefore the weakest zone at both ends of the season. And the sounds. Always the sounds. River ice talks constantly. Not loudly. It is not the dramatic cracking of spring breakup, not the explosive thermal crack of trees in the deep cold, but in a low, continuous register of creaks and ticks and, occasionally, a long resonant groan that travels through the ice from some distant point of stress and arrives at your feet as a vibration as much as a sound. Semyon processes all of it in real time, adjusting the route by meters in response to inputs that you are beginning to hear but not yet reliably interpret. He stops once on a section of ice that looks identical to everything around it and makes you stop behind him, and stands for perhaps 45 seconds listening and looking before taking a route that curves 20 meters to the left around whatever it is he has detected. You follow his exact track, feeling the sled on the ice behind you, and the surface is solid and the runners hiss and nothing happens, which is exactly what is supposed to happen, and you will never know exactly what was in those 20 meters to the right that he read and you did not. This is the accumulated weight of 50 years in one gesture. Your body's last bargain, which is the phrase that arrives in your mind on the river corridor without quite being invited, is not the dramatic final reserve's heroism of adventure fiction. It does not arrive with a speech or a sudden clarity or a second wind. It arrives as a quiet renegotiation of terms, a conversation between what you need to accomplish and what you have left to accomplish it with, conducted in the mute language of effort and response. The specific currency being negotiated is your lower back. It has been present as a low-level complaint since day one, the particular fatigue of muscles that stabilize the lumbar spine under sustained load in an unfamiliar harness configuration. On day 2 it escalated to a medium-level complaint. Today, on the river, pulling the sled in the harness for hour 6 of what will be an 8-hour travel day, it has submitted a formal proposal for the cessation of all load-bearing activities and is prepared to make its case loudly. You adjust the harness load points. You shorten your stride to reduce the rotational stress on the lumbar. You engage your core more actively, which costs caloric energy you can somewhat afford but attentional energy you are running closer to the margin on. You make a deal. Keep moving at this modified pace with this modified form, and the back will continue its work under protest rather than under revolt. The deal holds. This kind of negotiation, the ongoing management of a body under sustained extreme stress, the continuous adjustment of demands to capabilities, the refusal to either ignore the signals or surrender to them, is you are learning the central skill of endurance. Not strength, not toughness in the popular sense of the word, not the ability to push through pain as if the pain were not real. The ability to hear the pain accurately, to distinguish between the pain that is information about damage and the pain that is information about fatigue, and to respond to each appropriately. The back is fatigue. You know this because it is bilateral, diffuse in the muscles rather than the bone, absent the sharp specific character of structural damage. You have made the differential diagnosis on day 2, when it was milder and easier to assess, and you have confirmed it today. It is the protest of muscles doing unfamiliar work at high volume. It is not an instruction to stop. It is an instruction to modify and continue. You modify and continue. Semyon, on the 2 occasions he has checked in with you during the river corridor, has looked at your gait with the assessment quality that has characterized his attention since Yakutsk and given the same fractional nod both times. Not enthusiastic endorsement. Not concern. Acknowledgement that the situation is within the acceptable range of what this situation looks like at this point. This is, you have come to understand, high praise. The light fails in the early part of the afternoon's final hour, and the river corridor in starlight is a different thing from the river corridor in the low sun's golden wash. The ice surface, without the sun's angle to read its variations, becomes a single undifferentiated white that you navigate by sound and by following Semyon's form ahead of you, a dark shape moving against a slightly lighter background. The fiberglass poles of his own sled, he has taken on some of your load without ceremony or comment, redistributing weight between the 2 sleds in a way that added perhaps 8 kilometers of viable travel to your day, catching the starlight occasionally as they flex. The cold has deepened. Not dramatically. The ambient temperature has not changed significantly. Yakutian deep winter temperatures are stable in a way that more variable climates are not, the cold sitting at its extreme level with a consistency that is in its own way almost more demanding than temperature fluctuation. Because there is no warmer period to anticipate, no moderation to look forward to, just the same cold, always the baseline of existence. But the river has its own microclimate, the open corridor funneling whatever air movement exists, and in the evening the cold that has been accumulating in the air above the frozen water surface settles and deepens, and you can feel it against the exposed strip of your face as a slightly increased urgency, a slightly more insistent pressure. You rotate through the heating sequence for your hands. Make a fist, release, press the fist against your core, and your fingers report reluctantly that they are still operational. The tributary junction where tonight's camp waits is identifiable from a distance because of the tree configuration Semyon described this morning. 2 large, old-growth larch on the east bank, storm-damaged, one leaning toward the other like a conversation, and between them the entrance to the sheltered hollow where the river bends and the bank rises and the wind cannot reach. You see the trees before you see the hollow, silhouetted against the stars, and the sight of them, specific, recognizable, the landmark you have been navigating toward for 8 hours, produces a sensation that is not quite relief but is in its neighborhood. A loosening of something that has been held taut all day. The final push to the campsite, up off the river ice onto the bank and into the hollow, costs something. There is no inventory left in your muscles that does not cost something by this point. But the hollow is there, and the 2 leaning larches are there, and the wind is absent, and Semyon is already assessing the tent site with the unhurried attention that will, in 15 minutes, produce a standing shelter and a lit stove. You pull the sled up the bank. You stop. Something happens that you do not have good language for, and will not have good language for afterward, and this absence of language is not a failure of vocabulary but an accurate report on the nature of the experience. It is not dramatic. There is no surge of emotion, no tears, no collapse. It is quieter than that, and in its quietness more complete. You are standing in a hollow on the bank of a frozen tributary in -71 degrees Celsius in the dark in Yakutia, and your body hurts in ways you have never hurt before, and you are approximately 40 kilometers from any heated structure, and the cold is immense and constant and entirely indifferent to your presence. And you are not afraid. This is new. On day 1, beneath all the operational focus and the harness management and the step following, there was fear, low-level, controlled, appropriate but present. The fear of the margin, the fear of the gap between capability and requirement. Kept you sharp, which was its function, and you are not denigrating it. But it has been replaced by something else, something that is not its absence but its resolution, not the elimination of risk but the accurate understanding of it. the knowledge of your own capability and its limits that comes only from having operated at the edge of both for long enough to map them. Semyon is driving a tent stake. You unpack the tent poles. Your hands know what to do. The stove lights on the first attempt tonight, and the small blue flame in the vestibule of the tent is, for the third time, the most important fire in the world. Dinner is the same as the previous nights, the dense, fat-rich stew, the tea, the dense second bowl that your body receives with the same deep physiological gratitude, but the quality of the eating is different. Something in the day's travel has opened an appetite that goes beyond hunger, a cellular-level demand that makes the food taste, for the first time, of something. The fat is rich. The meat is complex. The tea is smoky and bitter and exactly right. Semyon watches you eat with the quality of attention that you have come to recognize as his version of satisfaction. Not displayed, not narrated, but present in the quality of his stillness. He says something. The interpreter has been quieter today than the previous days, the accumulation of cold and exertion hitting him somewhat harder than it is hitting Semyon, not at all harder than it is hitting you, and translates with a slight delay. He says, "The body is smarter than the mind thinks it is. The mind worries. The body learns." By the end, they agree. You hold this for a moment in the warmth of the stove's small radius. Outside, the cold holds its position with the patience of something that has been waiting here for a very long time and is prepared to wait considerably longer. The larch trees are still. The tributary ice ticks and creaks in its low frozen register. The stars are immense. Your back aches. Your hips ache. Your legs have submitted their closing arguments and retired. You pull the sleeping bag over your shoulders and close the draft collar and lie in the dark listening to the cold outside the tent. And the cold is no longer a wall between you and something else. It is simply where you are. It is simply what this is. The mind has caught up to the body. You sleep. You smell the village before you see it. This is not a metaphor and it is not a poetic embellishment. It is a literal sensory event that occurs somewhere in the final 3 kilometers of the traverse, when the route curves northeast along the last frozen river corridor and the wind, coming from ahead of you for the first time in 4 days, carries something that your nose processes before your conscious mind has a framework for it. With smoke, not the clean, resinous smoke of larch burning in the open air. You have been smelling that for days, from your own stove, and it has become as neutral and expected as the cold itself. This is different. This is the smell of smoke from structures, from chimneys, from fires burning inside walls. The specific compound scent of human habitation that carries beneath its surface notes the suggestion of food, of animals, of the lived proximity of other people. Your body responds to it before you decide to respond to it. Your pace quickens fractionally. The sled pulls differently when you are moving faster, the poles transmitting a slightly higher frequency of information through your hips, and you feel this change and note it and do not slow down. Semyon, ahead of you, glances back once with the particular quality of attention he deploys when he is checking your status, registers something in your posture or your pace, and turns forward again without comment. He is walking faster too. Neither of you mentions this. The final push of an extreme traverse is not, it turns out, the triumphant final sprint of athletic competition. Your body has no sprint left in it and would not deploy one even if it did, because sprinting means sweating and sweating means wet layers, and wet layers in these temperatures remain a real and consequent risk until the moment you are inside a heated building with the door closed behind you. The final push is the same as every other push. Deliberate, paced, managed. 1 foot in front of the other, the sled following, the cold around you. The difference is only that the destination, which for 4 days has been a concept, tonight's camp, tomorrow's segment, the general direction of forward, has become specific and proximate. And the specific proximity of it does something to the mind that has nothing to do with physics and everything to do with being human. The trees thin. The river corridor opens. And there, at the river's bend, sitting on a low bluff above the east bank, is the village. It is not large. 30 or 40 structures, perhaps, wooden houses built in the traditional Yakutian style, low and deep-walled against the cold, their roofs steeply pitched to shed snow load, every one of them raised on the short stilts or foundations that keep permafrost from migrating into the building's thermal envelope. Smoke rises from every chimney in the still air, straight up, because there is no wind here in the shelter of the bluff, the separate columns rising and then drifting together overhead into a low, dispersed cloud that catches the starlight and glows faintly. A communal exhalation, the village breathing into the cold sky. The lights in the windows are yellow-orange, the warm spectrum light of incandescent bulbs that looks, from outside in the dark at -71, like something that exists in a different physical register from the cold and the dark and the stars. Not just warmer, ontologically different. Light from inside a structure, seen from outside in extreme cold, is not merely illumination. It is an argument. You stand at the river's edge and look at it for a moment, just a moment, because standing still at these temperatures is still standing still. And the argument the light makes is very simple and very old and entirely convincing. Come inside. The woman who greets you at the first house is Semyon's sister-in-law, which you learn afterward. In the moment, she is simply a broad, warm-faced woman of perhaps 60 who opens the door before you have knocked. She has, apparently, been watching your approach from the window for the last 20 minutes, and says something that your interpreter renders, from the doorway where he is already largely inside, as approximately, well, you're still alive, that's better than last time. The last time, it emerges, was 12 years ago, when Semyon made this traverse with a journalist from Moscow who had to be evacuated by snowmobile on day 2 with the first stages of frostbite in 3 fingers on his right hand. The journalist had, against advice, removed his outer mitt to take photographs and held the camera with bare fingers for approximately 4 minutes. His fingers recovered fully. He wrote an article that Semyon describes, through the interpreter, with a brief Saka phrase that the interpreter declines to translate directly but characterizes as broadly skeptical of the journalist's subsequent expertise. You step inside. The temperature differential between the outside air and the interior of the house is approximately 90 degrees Celsius, which is an abstract statement that your body receives as a physical event of considerable force. It is not the pleasant warmth of stepping out of a cool evening into a heated home. It is not comfortable at first. It is, briefly, overwhelming, your cold-adapted sensory systems registering the heat as almost aggressive, the suddenly warm air on your face feeling, for a few seconds, like pressure rather than temperature, your skin firing off signals that require reinterpretation before they can be filed under good rather than alarming. You stand in the small entry hall and breathe. Semyon, beside you, is already beginning the careful, sequenced process of removing outer layers, the same sequence as dressing in reverse, the system being dismantled in the same order it was built to prevent the mistakes that come from doing it wrong. Outer mitts first, hung on the specific hooks provided for them near the door, not placed on the floor where they would absorb moisture from the boards and not placed on the radiator where too rapid temperature change could damage the hide. Outer boots next. The doha last, removed with a specific motion that keeps the fur interior from inverting and losing its alignment. You follow the sequence. Your base layer, when you finally reach it, is damp. Not soaked, the system worked, more or less, the moisture management layers having done their job of keeping the worst of the sweat from saturating the insulating layers, but carrying the accumulated moisture of 4 days of sustained effort in a way that is evident to the nose and to the touch and to the deep relief your skin expresses when the air, even warm air, reaches it directly for the first time in 4 days. The sister-in-law takes one look at your base layer and says something with the decisive quality of a person who has seen this before and has opinions about it, and points toward a door that turns out to lead to a small room with a wood-burning stove and a wooden bench and a bucket of water that is somehow still liquid, and the universal gesture she makes is the universal gesture for go wash and then come eat. The washing is an experience that deserves its own extended treatment and will not receive it here, because the meal that follows it demands space, but the washing, sponge bath from the bucket of stove-warmed water, working from the extremities inward, feeling 4 days of effort and cold leaving the surface of your skin in a physical and almost ceremonial transaction, is one of the most purely satisfying experiences of your adult life, and you note this without embarrassment. The meal is the culmination of everything Semyon has been describing and demonstrating since the first evening in the tent, which is to say it is a Saka winter meal in full register, prepared by someone who has been cooking in this tradition their entire life and who has, you suspect, been quietly cooking it since she saw you appear on the river ice 20 minutes ago. Stroganina first, the dish that is perhaps the most singular expression of Yakutian food culture, and that has no real equivalent anywhere in the world's culinary traditions. Thin slivers of frozen raw fish, sliced from a solid frozen whitefish directly in the kitchen. The knife moving in long practiced strokes. The fish so cold that the slices hold their shape and curl slightly at the edges. Served immediately on a wooden board with a dish of salt and a dish of a wild herb mixture that the sister-in-law names and that the interpreter cannot immediately translate. You eat them before they thaw as instructed, and the experience is you spend a moment looking for the word clean. Cold and clean and faintly oceanic, the flavor of the fish concentrated by the freezing process in a way that cooking would dissolve. Then reindeer soup, which is everything the stew on the trail was and more. The fat-rich broth carrying the complex mineral depth of long-simmered bone alongside the specific, dark flavor of the reindeer meat, with wild roots and dried mushrooms and a grain that has been cooking since before you arrived, absorbing the broth into a gentle thickened texture that is the opposite of the dense, engineered nutrition of the trail food. This is not fuel. This is, here the word arrives without effort, home. This is what food tastes like when it has been made slowly by someone who knows what you need after something hard. You eat 3 bowls. Semyon eats 4. The sister-in-law watches both of you eat with the quiet satisfaction of someone performing a specific and valued function and performing it well, and refills the bowls without being asked, and says something that the interpreter renders as, "You can always tell a real winter journey by how a person eats at the end of it." The thawing of the body, which proceeds through the meal and into the evening, is not immediate and is not without its own discomforts. Frost nip, the superficial, reversible cold injury that you have been managing in your fingertips and the tip of your nose since day 1, announces its full presence as the affected tissues warm. The sensation is a deep, specific tingling that builds to something approaching pain before subsiding, the nerve endings in the recovering tissue firing off a backlog of signals that the cold had been suppressing. This is normal and expected, and you have been told to expect it, which does not make it entirely comfortable but does make it manageable. The tissues are not damaged. They are returning. Your feet, when you finally remove the boot liners and the vapor barrier socks and the liner socks and reach the actual skin, are paler than usual, and there is a brief period of the same tingling intensity, and then color returns, first white, then the transient pink of reactive hyperemia, the blood vessels that have been suppressed for 4 days flooding back to capacity. And by the time the second bowl of soup is empty, your feet are warm in a way they have not been since Yakutsk. The body is reclaiming itself, territory by territory, with the patient thoroughness of something that has been waiting. Later, much later, after the meal, after the tea, after a conversation conducted half in Saka and half in gesture and fully in the warmth of the stove-heated room, Semyon says something that he has apparently been waiting to say, or that the warmth and the food and the end of the traverse have made sayable in a way the trail did not. The interpreter listens carefully and takes a moment before translating, in the way he does when the words require precision rather than speed. He says, "The cold does not change. Every year it is the same cold. But every year the person who walks through it is different afterward. This is not because the cold teaches. Cold is indifferent. It does not teach. It reveals. What was already in you, it simply becomes visible. In the cold, there is nowhere to hide from yourself. Whatever is there, you find it. Whatever is not there, you discover its absence. This is the only thing the cold does. Everything else is what you do." You sit with this for a long moment in the warm room with the stove ticking and the smoke rising outside the window, and your body gradually, incrementally, returning to its ordinary temperature, and the soup warming from the inside out, and the stars beginning their slow nightly rotation above the village. Outside, the cold holds its position. -71. The same cold it was 4 days ago. The same cold it will be tomorrow and the day after. The larch trees stand in it. The reindeer move through it. The river lies frozen under it, ticking and groaning in its low, patient register. The permafrost holds the bones of mammoths that have been cold for 40,000 years, waiting with perfect indifference for whatever comes next. And in the morning, somewhere between 3 and 4 a.m., something happens that Semyon has mentioned once in passing on the second day of the traverse, when you asked what brings him back to this route year after year. The sun, at this latitude and this time of year, rises at approximately 10 in the morning. But before it rises, before the horizon even begins its amber hesitation, there is a moment, in the deep blue dark of the pre-dawn, when the sky above the eastern tree line shifts. Not brightens, not exactly, but shifts. A quality change rather than a quantity change, a deepening of the blue towards something that carries, impossibly and unmistakably, the suggestion of warmth even though the warmth is still hours away and the temperature outside is still the same temperature it has been since November. Historians and astronomers have names for the stages of twilight: astronomical, nautical, civil, and the physics of what produces the pre-dawn sky's changing character are well understood. The sun's light scattering through progressively thinner slices of atmosphere as it approaches the horizon from below. What is not captured in the physics, and what Semyon has been waiting for you to see, is the quality of the moment when the darkness first acknowledges that the darkness is not permanent. You are awake for it because something has woken you. Not the cold, which is the same cold, not a sound, which would have woken Semyon too. And he is asleep, and you lie in the sleeping bag in the small room the sister-in-law has made available and look through the window at the sky above the eastern tree line. And there it is, the blue deepening and shifting and carrying within it, improbably, impossibly, with the specific irrational certainty of things that are true before they can be proven, the suggestion of what is coming. The sun that is not here yet, the warmth that is still hours away. The world, cold and dark and absolute and indifferent, giving the smallest, most qualified acknowledgement that it contains within itself the capacity for its opposite. You watch it for a long time. The cold outside does not change. The stars above do not change. But something in the sky above the eastern tree line keeps its slow, quiet appointment with the approaching sun, and you watch it, and the watching is enough. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles at the end of something hard. Not the quiet of exhaustion, though exhaustion is present. Not the quiet of relief, though that is there too. It is the quiet of a thing completed, whole, finished, held now in memory rather than in the body's immediate experience. The weight of the sled no longer in the harness. The cold no longer a demand but a fact, outside the window, outside the walls, held at its proper distance by the warmth of the room and the solidity of the walls and the fire in the stove that has been burning in houses like this one, in this landscape, for as long as people have found ways to be here. Let the cold recede now. Let it take its proper place at the edge of things, where it has always been and where it will remain, patient and immense and entirely itself, asking nothing, demanding nothing, simply present the way that large and permanent things are present. You crossed it. Your feet know the shape of it. Your hands know the cold of it. Your back knows the weight of the sled, and your lungs know the taste of the frozen air, and your mind knows, now, the particular quality of silence that lives inside extreme cold, the way the cold simplifies and strips and reveals. What the cold revealed in you, that is yours to keep. It will not be taken back when the temperature rises. It lives now in a different place than knowledge usually lives, deeper than language, available in the hands and the feet and the steady rhythm of a body that has learned something it did not know before and cannot unlearn. You crossed it. Rest now. The stove is warm. The soup was good. The smoke is rising straight up from the chimney into the dark sky, and the stars are the campfires of people who already made this journey, and the sun is coming slowly with enormous patience from below the horizon, and the cold outside is the same cold it has always been, and you are not. Dim the lights. Breathe slowly. Let the weight of the sled go from your shoulders. You are warm now. Sleep.